Section 1. The World Before the Bombs, Vault-Tec, and the Grand Deception. Picture a version of America that never quite became our America. The cars run on nuclear power and hover a few inches off the ground. The television sets glow with a warm, amber-tinted optimism that feels borrowed from a 1950s dream that never ended. Skyscrapers rise across cities that never saw the social upheaval of the 1960s, never experienced the technological disruptions of the internet age, never moved beyond the cultural shell of post-war prosperity. The world of Fallout is frozen in amber, a retro-futurist fantasy where atom power solved every energy crisis and created 100 new catastrophes in exchange. And somewhere in that world, behind glass-fronted office buildings and smiling mascot posters, a company called Vault-Tec was quietly constructing the most elaborate lie in human history. The pitch was simple. A nuclear war was coming. Everyone knew it. The tension between the United States and China had been building for decades over oil reserves, resource scarcity, and old grudges dressed up in new uniforms. Vault-Tec, a private corporation with deep government contracts and deeper government connections, stepped into this national anxiety with an answer that felt like a gift. They would build underground vaults, enormous, reinforced, self-sustaining communities buried beneath the soil of America, capable of housing hundreds of people for generations at a time. The air would be recycled. The food would be grown in hydroponic bays, the water would be filtered and purified, and the residents would emerge someday into a cleansed world, ready to rebuild civilization. The advertisements featured Vault Boy, that cheerful, round-faced mascot with eternal thumbs up grinning across billboards and television screens as if the apocalypse was just another product launch. People lined up, people applied, people paid, people hoped. The truth, which almost no ordinary citizen ever learned before the bombs actually fell on the 23rd of October, 2077, was considerably darker than any advertisement could convey. Vault-Tec was commissioned by the American government to construct exactly 122 vaults. At the time, the United States had a population approaching 400 million people. Do the math yourself and you start to feel the weight of it. 122 vaults, even generous ones housing several hundred residents each, could save only a vanishingly small fraction of the population. This was not a rescue program. This was a selection program. And the selection criteria had nothing to do with survival at all. According to the Fallout Bible, a foundational lore document compiled by writer Chris Avallone, the real reason those vaults were built was to study pre-selected segments of the population. The government and Vault-Tec wanted to observe how isolated groups of humans would behave under extreme stress, under strange conditions, under social pressures that had never been tested in history. They wanted data. They wanted to understand the fundamental nature of human behavior when the normal rules of society vanished and people had nowhere to run. The vaults were not survival shelters dressed up as experiments. They were experiments dressed up as survival shelters. Of the 122 vaults constructed, only 17 were what the company called control vaults, facilities designed to function more or less as advertised, where residents would live relatively normal underground lives before eventually emerging to repopulate the surface. The remaining 105 vaults were each assigned an experiment. Some of those experiments were relatively mundane. An overpopulated vault here, a diverse ideological mix there. Some were ethically questionable but not immediately lethal. And some were so profoundly disturbing that the people who dreamed them up seem, from the other side of history, to have lost their connection to basic human decency somewhere along the way. The residents who entered these vaults in the desperate minutes and hours after the bombs began to fall had no idea what they were walking into. They carried their children, they dragged their suitcases, they clutched the admission cards that Vault-Tec had sent them in the mail, confirmation of their reserved spot in humanity's future. Some of them were chosen based on their professional skills, their genetic profiles, their psychological evaluations. Others were selected because they fit a particular demographic profile that Vault-Tec needed for a particular experiment. A few were chosen essentially at random, or based on criteria so obscure and calculated that the residents themselves would never have guessed. The vaults ranged across the entire continental United States, though the highest concentration appears to have been in California, the capital wasteland around what had once been Washington, D.C., the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the Mojave Desert, and the Appalachian region of what had been West Virginia. Each vault was a sealed world unto itself, with its own power source, its own food production systems, its own hierarchy of overseers and security personnel. The overseers, the appointed managers of each vault, were sometimes aware of the experiment they were running. Sometimes they were kept in the dark just like everyone else, their job simply to maintain order and follow the operational parameters that Vault-Tec had programmed into the facility's computers. When the Great War came and the nuclear fire swept across the continent in a matter of hours, the vault doors sealed. Some sealed smoothly, completing the purpose for which they were built. Some sealed incorrectly, by design. A few never sealed at all. And behind every one of those heavy steel doors, a different story began to unfold, a story that would play out over decades or centuries, invisible to the rest of the ruined world, written only in terminal entries and audio logs and the bones of people who deserved better. This is a collection of those stories, 101 of them, pulled from across the entire history of the Fallout universe, spanning the original games, the Bethesda era, the Appalachian adventure of Fallout 76, and the Prime Video television series that brought these underground horrors to a whole new audience. Each vault is a world. Each world has a story. Some of those stories end in triumph. Most of them end somewhere between tragedy and silence. Get comfortable. The surface is gone. The door is sealed behind you, and the vault has a story it wants to tell. If you're enjoying this so far, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a great time. There are a lot of vaults to get through, and we're just getting started. Section 2. The California Vaults, where it all began. The Fallout universe started in California, both narratively and geographically. The first game released in 1997 and placed players in the sun-baked ruins of Southern California, where the remnants of civilization were slowly rebuilding themselves from the wreckage. 3 vaults anchored the original story: Vault 13, Vault 15, and the tragic Vault 12 in what had once been the city of Bakersfield. Understanding these 3 vaults is like reading the first chapter of a much longer and darker book. Everything that came later in the series grew from the roots planted here. Vault 13 sits at the beginning of everything. It was designated as a control vault, of a sort, but its true purpose was more specific than mere survival. According to the Fallout Bible, Vault 13 was intended to stay sealed for 200 years, 2 full centuries of isolation, during which its population would be studied for the psychological effects of prolonged confinement. How would multiple generations of people adapt to life in an underground box with no horizon, no seasons, no contact with the outside world? How would culture evolve, or stagnate, or mutate? What happens to human identity when the only world you know is a series of corridors and common rooms? The overseer of Vault 13 knew about this experiment. He was one of the few who did Vault-Tec informed certain overseers of their vault's purpose so that they could help manage the conditions of the study. And the overseer took this responsibility seriously, perhaps too seriously. When the vault's water chip, the component that managed the entire water purification system, broke down after only 80 years, the overseer faced an impossible choice. Send someone to the surface to find a replacement chip, which would blow the isolation study, or let the vault slowly die of thirst. He sent someone out. That someone was the Vault Dweller, the player character of the original game, and their journey into the wasteland is what kicked off the entire Fallout narrative. But here's the detail that makes Vault 13 genuinely unsettling, rather than merely unfortunate. When the Vault Dweller returned, victorious and changed by months in the wasteland, the Overseer exiled them. Not out of cruelty exactly, but out of a cold, calculating loyalty to the experiment. The Vault Dweller had seen the surface. They had skills, connections, perspectives that no one inside the vault possessed. Their presence would contaminate the isolation study. The data would be compromised. So the Overseer sent the person who had just saved everyone's life into the wilderness, alone. That decision haunted Vault 13's history for years afterward. The Overseer was eventually executed by his own people when the truth came out. The vault's experiment was already broken, but the damage the experiment caused to the people inside it would take generations to heal. Vault 15 had a different kind of damage built into it from the start. The experiment here involved ideology. Vault-Tec selected residents who came from radically diverse backgrounds, belief systems, and political orientations, and then sealed them all underground together for 50 years to see what would happen. The answer, which you have probably already guessed, was not pretty. Rather than finding common ground or forging a unified culture, the residents of Vault 15 fractured. They formed tribes based on their original identities and worldviews. By the time the vault finally opened, those tribes spilled out into the wasteland and became some of the most persistent and violent raider gangs of the region: the Khans, the Vipers, and the Jackals. The Vault 15 experiment did not produce a harmonious multicultural society. It produced a pressure cooker that finally exploded. There is a certain grim clarity to the Vault 15 story. It assumes that ideology, once held deeply enough, will outlast physical comfort, shared threat, and the simple need to survive. People who went underground with their identities intact came out with those identities hardened rather than dissolved. The wasteland they emerged into was not much different from the one they had created inside the vault. Vault 12 is the one that turns your stomach a little. The people who entered Vault 12 in Bakersfield believed, as everyone did, that the vault would seal behind them and keep them safe. Vault-Tec's engineers had other plans. The vault door of Vault 12 was specifically designed to malfunction, not to fail catastrophically just enough. The door would not seal completely, leaving a gap that let radiation seep steadily into the facility over decades. The experiment was designed to study the long-term effects of radiation on a human population in a controlled underground setting. What does radiation do to people over years and generations? How do bodies adapt or fail to adapt? What does a community look like when it slowly transforms? The answer, centuries later, was Necropolis, a city of ghouls. The radiation-transformed remnants of Vault 12's original population, and the people who had sought shelter with them after the bombs fell. Ghouls in the Fallout universe are humans who absorbed enough radiation to be horribly disfigured but not killed outright. Their skin hangs loose, their eyes are often milky white, their voices are rough and ruined. Many retain full human intelligence and personality. Many become feral, their minds degraded by the radiation that preserved their bodies. The people of Vault 12 did not choose this. They entered a vault on the promise of survival and were instead transformed into something their descendants would spend generations trying to make peace with. What makes this particularly hard to look away from is the paperwork. Someone at Vault-Tec designed this. They sat at a desk, drew up blueprints, calculated exactly how wide the gap in the door needed to be to allow the right amount of radiation inside, signed off on the specifications, and filed the documents. The people walking toward that vault door on the day the bombs fell were not statistics to the individuals who designed their shelter. They were just inconveniently human in a situation that required treating them as data points. Vault 8, just to offer a moment of contrast, was one of the genuine control vaults. It was designed to hold 1,000 people, and to open after 10 years, on schedule, with its residents ready to go out and help rebuild civilization. It worked. The residents of Vault 8 emerged after a decade underground, established a settlement, and over the following centuries built Vault City, one of the most technologically advanced communities in all of post-war California, famous for its sophisticated medicine and its deeply complicated relationship with the wasteland communities around it. The Fallout Bible notes, somewhat dryly, that Vault City was the result of Vault 8, unfortunately, because despite its success in the survival sense, Vault City's culture became notoriously insular, suspicious of outsiders, and reliant on a kind of aristocratic pride that made them difficult neighbors. Even the experiments that worked left marks. Vault 15's overflow led to the town of Shady Sands, which later became the capital of the new California Republic, the largest and most organized political entity in the post-war West. There is something quietly hopeful about that particular thread. The vault that was designed to test whether ideologically diverse people could survive underground produced, indirectly, the seeds of a genuine democratic government. The Khans and the Vipers became raiders. The Shady Sands settlers became a republic. Human nature, it turns out, is not quite as predictably grim as Vault-Tec's experiments seem to assume. Vault 29 enters the California chapter as something Vault-Tec inflicted on families. According to the Fallout Bible, no resident of Vault 29 was over the age of 15 when they entered. The parents were redirected deliberately by Vault-Tec staff at the surface entry points to other vaults. Children were separated from their parents in the chaos of the end of the world, fed into the vault alone, and the adults who had brought them to safety were sent elsewhere. The experiment, presumably, was about raising a population without the influence of pre-war adult culture and authority, to see what kind of society children would build on their own over generations. What the children experienced on that day, the confusion, the screaming for parents who were being turned away, the vault door closing on a world that no longer contained their families, is something the games leave largely to the imagination. Harold, one of the more beloved characters in Fallout lore, is believed to have come from Vault 29. Harold eventually became something extraordinary, a man slowly transformed by FEV into something more than human, growing into the Earth itself. Whether his origins in Vault 29 had anything to do with who he became is never fully addressed. The silence around it feels deliberate. Vault 17 is a darker footnote. It was raided by the Master's Army, the early super mutant forces controlled by one of the original Fallout's primary antagonists, and its residents were taken to be used as subjects in the forced evolutionary virus. Experiments that were producing the Master's super mutant forces. This was not Vault-Tec's experiment. This was something that happened after the Vault system had already served its purpose, when the post-war world had developed enough power structures of its own to exploit whatever it found underground. Not every Vault story ends because of what Vault-Tec built into it. Some end because the wasteland is simply merciless. Section 3. The Strange and the Cruel Mojave Vaults, Part 1. The Mojave Desert was always a strange place, even before the bombs. The kind of landscape where the heat makes you see things that aren't there, where the distances between settlements are vast enough to swallow whole communities. In the Fallout New Vegas portion of the lore, the Mojave region was home to 6 substantial vaults, and each of them could fill a chapter on its own. Together, they represent some of the most creative and some of the most disturbing experiments in the entire Vault-Tec program. Vault 3 is the Mojave's quiet tragedy. It was built as a control vault, no experiment assigned, no hidden cruelty embedded in the walls. The residents of Vault 3 were meant to simply live there until the Overseer decided conditions on the surface were acceptable for emergence. For decades, they did. They built a community, they maintained their systems, raised their children, celebrated their holidays in the recycled air of their underground home. By the standards of the Vault-Tec program, Vault 3 was a success. The people inside were psychologically stable, the vault was functioning, and the Overseer was managing the population with reasonable competence. Then a water leak flooded the lower chambers. Not a catastrophic breach, just a slow, persistent seeping of water into levels that couldn't drain it properly. The Overseer made the call that the outside world was worth the risk, and Vault 3 opened its doors. The residents who emerged did so into the Mojave wasteland, hoping to find what their vault had always promised: humanity on the topside. What they found instead was the Fiends, a particularly brutal gang of raiders with a reputation for extreme violence and a distinctive green mohawk aesthetic. The Fiends moved into Vault 3, killed the residents who hadn't managed to escape, and claimed it as their territory. By the time the player encounters it in New Vegas, Vault 3 is a raider stronghold, its clean corridors now stained and broken, its history visible only in the scattered remnants of what had been a genuinely functioning community. The cruelty of Vault 3's story is that it didn't require Vault-Tec's intervention. The vault itself was fine. The people inside were fine. The world outside is what destroyed them. Vault 19 was designed around something that doesn't require physical force to break a person: paranoia. Vault-Tec assigned this vault an experiment in induced anxiety. The population was divided into 2 distinct groups, Red Sector and Blue Sector, each with their own overseer, their own common spaces, and their own increasingly distorted understanding of the people on the other side of the vault. The experiment did not use chemical agents or physical threats. Instead, the vault was engineered to create a low-grade, ambient atmosphere of suspicion. Subliminal messages played through the intercom systems. Strange sounds echoed through corridors at odd hours. The lighting in certain areas flickered at carefully calculated frequencies. The Overseers were instructed to reinforce the idea that the other sector might be responsible for whatever was going wrong at any given moment. The methodology mirrors a number of real-world psychological experiments. If you tell people they are in competition with another group, even if that group is identical to them, even if the competition is entirely arbitrary, human beings will begin generating reasons why the other group is threatening and untrustworthy. Add subliminal audio cues and deliberate environmental stress, and the process accelerates dramatically. Vault 19's experiment was designed to study whether paranoia could be induced purely through environmental manipulation without resorting to drugs or direct violence. For a while, it worked. The red and blue sectors developed genuine animosity toward each other, based on nothing more concrete than the colors they wore and the whispers they kept hearing. But then something Vault-Tec hadn't accounted for arrived. A sulfur leak from a nearby mine began seeping into the vault's lower levels. The residents were already paranoid. Now they were paranoid and experiencing debilitating headaches. The resulting chaos destroyed whatever remained of the experiment's controlled conditions. Vault 19 was eventually abandoned, its population scattered into the wasteland, many of them so psychologically damaged by years of induced anxiety that they struggled to trust anyone for the rest of their lives. Vault 21 is one of the few Mojave vaults whose story ended in something approximating normalcy, which is almost more disorienting than the alternatives. The experiment here was gambling. Vault-Tec populated this facility with residents who had a strong inclination toward games of chance and then structured the entire social system around it. Instead of a traditional overseer making unilateral decisions, conflicts within Vault 21 were resolved by gambling. Disputes over living quarters, food allocation, work assignments, and even personal grievances all went to the table. The game determined the outcome. Everyone abided by the result. This sounds ridiculous, and in many ways it is, but Vault 21's story suggests it also sort of worked. The randomness of gambling is genuinely impartial in a way that human judgment almost never manages to be. If two people are fighting over the same bedroom and a dice roll decides who gets it, neither person can accuse the other of having political connections or being the overseer's favorite. The vault's residents seemed, according to the records and terminal entries available in the game, to have managed a fairly stable community by the standards of the Vault-Tec program. Eventually, Robert House, the eccentric pre-war visionary who had essentially preserved himself in a life support system beneath what would become New Vegas, found his way to Vault 21. He challenged the vault's overseer, Sarah, to a high-stakes gambling contest. She accepted because the rules required her to, and House won. He claimed the vault as part of his vision for the new Las Vegas, repurposed it as a hotel and casino, and sealed the original lower chambers with concrete. The residents were offered jobs in his new empire. Sarah eventually opened a gift shop. By post-apocalyptic standards, this is a reasonably good outcome. Vault 22 is called the Green Vault, and the name carries an irony that becomes clear fairly quickly once you understand what happened inside it. The experiment here was agricultural. A team of scientists was assigned to develop food production technologies that could sustain large populations in a post-nuclear environment, using plants cultivated entirely underground without traditional sunlight or soil. The goal was practical and genuinely humanitarian in ambition: develop methods for feeding a post-war civilization using resources that could be grown anywhere, regardless of surface conditions. The science succeeded. The plants grew. The techniques that Vault 22's scientists developed for hydroponic cultivation in confined spaces were genuinely groundbreaking, and the data they produced would have been enormously valuable to anyone trying to rebuild agriculture after the war. But somewhere in the process of developing these remarkable underground growing systems, the scientists created a strain of fungal pesticide designed to protect their crops from contamination. That pesticide introduced spores into the vault's air circulation system. The spores infected the residents, and then the residents began to change. Vault 22's human population slowly transformed into spore carriers. Humanoid creatures somewhere between person and plant, their bodies colonized by the fungal organism that had started as a simple crop protector. The vault itself became overgrown, its corridors choked with vegetation, its terminals recording a descent from scientific optimism into terror and silence. By the time players explore it in New Vegas, Vault 22 is a place where the plants have won a dense, jungle-like environment inside a sealed underground space, with the remnants of its human population lurking in the vegetation. The data the scientists left behind is still valuable, which is part of why various factions in the game send people in to retrieve it. None of those people come back in good condition. Vault 27 falls into the category of experiments that feel almost banal in their cruelty. Not spectacular, just relentless. Vault-Tec deliberately populated Vault 27 at twice its intended capacity. The design parameters for the facility were sized for a certain number of residents, the food and water systems planned accordingly, the living quarters arranged with a particular density in mind. And then Vault-Tec simply let in double the number of people the vault was meant to house. No explanation to the residents, no warning. The crowding would begin immediately, and it would never improve. Every shared space, every meal, every night's sleep in a room with too many bunks, all of it became a test of whether human beings can maintain social cohesion when their most basic physical comfort is perpetually under stress. The Fallout Bible records Vault 27's existence but doesn't elaborate extensively on how it ended. In your imagination, fill in the decades. The growing resentment over space, the factions that form based on who got assigned better quarters in the early days, the arguments over food and air, and the right to sit in a particular chair in the common room. Overcrowding is a remarkably effective instrument for destroying the social bonds that hold communities together. Give people enough physical discomfort and not enough room to escape each other, and the civility that most of us maintain in normal life starts to wear thin. Vault 29 in this chapter deserves a second mention for a different reason. Some accounts of Vault 29's experiment suggest that the children inside it were raised under the influence of Zax, the early artificial intelligence system developed by Vault-Tec, who shaped their education and values toward environmentalism and a rejection of pre-war technological civilization. The children who grew up there were, in theory, being prepared to build a society from scratch, without the biases and assumptions of their parents' generation. Whether this produced something meaningful or simply created a generation of people who were deeply confused about who they were and where they'd come from, the lore doesn't fully resolve. What it does resolve is the image of those children standing at the vault entrance on the day the bombs fell, watching adults in Vault-Tec uniforms separate them from their parents with polished smiles and the assurance that everything would be taken care of. That image is not in the game explicitly, it exists in the space between the documented facts. But it's one of the hardest images in all of Fallout to shake. Section 4. Plants, Weapons, and the Armory that Ate Itself. Vault 22 and Vault 34. We've already walked through Vault 22 in the previous section, but it deserves a moment more of attention before we move on, because the story of how it ended wasn't just a biological accident. The scientists of Vault 22 were, by all available accounts, genuinely dedicated people. They were working on a real problem, how to feed people after the end of the agricultural world they'd grown up in, and they were making genuine progress. The terminal entries left inside the vault document a community that was, for a period, hopeful and functional. People had roles that felt meaningful. They were contributing to something that might outlast the war and help whoever survived it. The tragedy of Vault 22 is that the thing that destroyed it wasn't the experiment itself. It was an accident of the experiment. The fungal pesticide wasn't designed to do what it did to the residents. Someone's safety calculation was wrong. Someone underestimated the speed at which airborne spores could colonize a sealed environment. Someone assumed that the atmospheric controls of the vault would prevent contamination from spreading beyond the growing bays. Each of those someones made a reasonable assumption at the time, and the combination of their reasonable assumptions created a catastrophe that consumed every person in the vault. This particular flavor of disaster, not malice, but the compounding of small errors in a closed system, is one that appears again and again in the Fallout universe's vault stories. Vault-Tec could design deliberate cruelty easily enough. What they couldn't fully account for was how complex systems fail in unexpected ways once people start living in them. Vault 34 is one of the Mojave's simplest experiments on paper, and one of its most predictable disasters in practice. The experiment. Stock the vault with significantly more weapons and ammunition than the population could possibly need, and don't provide a lock for the armory. No authority figure between the residents and the weapons. Plenty of firepower and plenty of people in a confined space with naturally occurring tensions. Vault-Tec wanted to observe how an armed civilian population would manage itself. The armory being overstocked was not an accident or an oversight. It was the design. Every crate of ammunition, every rifle on the wall, every grenade in the storage locker was there because someone at Vault-Tec calculated that having too many weapons would stress the social structure of the community in interesting ways. Would the residents organize themselves around the weapons, forming factions based on who controlled the armory? Would they establish their own gun control regulations? Would having access to overwhelming force make the population more peaceful because any individual act of violence risked catastrophic escalation? Or would it make them more violent because the weapons were always available and the temptation was always present? The answer Vault 34 arrived at was neither stability nor measured escalation. It was chronic, low-grade violence that slowly shredded the community over the years. The overseer eventually tried to lock the armory, which the residents rejected as an abuse of authority. Factions formed, gunfights broke out. The weapons weren't the only problem. The vault was also overcrowded. Its reactor was malfunctioning, and there wasn't enough food to keep people comfortable, but the weapons made every other problem worse. In another vault, arguments over food allocation might result in shouting matches and formal complaints. In Vault 34, they tended to result in somebody getting shot. The final collapse of Vault 34 involved a flooded reactor and the irradiation of much of the vault's lower levels. When the player encounters it in New Vegas, it is partly submerged, partly irradiated, and inhabited by ghouls, the radiated remnants of people who were still alive when the reactor failed, or who had been in the vault so long that the accumulated radiation had already begun changing them. The armory is still there. The weapons are still there. Nobody won. There is a particular detail about Vault 34 that deserves a moment of reflection. The Overseer's final log entry. It was written in the knowledge that the vault was finished, that the experiment, if it could still be called that by then, had produced the outcome that even Vault-Tec might have admitted was likely. The entry isn't accusatory. It's just tired. Decades of trying to maintain order in a place that had been deliberately designed to resist it, and at the end, a reactor failure and rising water, and the quiet understanding that it had all gone exactly the way anyone paying attention might have predicted. That tiredness is one of the most human notes in the entire New Vegas Vault collection. It doesn't scream. It doesn't rail against Vault-Tec or the experiment or the government that commissioned all of this. It just stops. Like someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time, finally deciding to put it down. Section 5. Children, Soldiers, and Scientists. Vault 75, 77, and 81. Some of the most disturbing vaults in the entire Fallout universe are the ones that targeted children. There is something that makes the mind recoil at the idea of Vault-Tec's cold, experimental logic being applied to people who hadn't yet developed the capacity to consent to anything, let alone to whatever the company had planned for them. Vault 75 is the clearest example of this, and it is also one of the most elaborately cruel facilities in the entire program. Vault 75 sits beneath the ruins of Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, the former Massachusetts. The vault's cover story was that it was designed to protect the school's staff and the families of its students during the nuclear emergency. Parents were told that if the bombs fell, bringing their children to the school would ensure their safety. The doors were wide. The admission process was smooth. The Vault-Tec personnel at the entrance were professional and reassuring. They checked names against lists, they guided families into the facility, and they smiled the entire time. Once inside, the children were separated from the adults at the first checkpoint. Parents and teachers were ushered into a room for what they were told was an orientation session. They were executed. Every adult who walked through those doors was killed before the orientation session ended. The children never saw them again. What followed, for the children who survived Vault 75's intake process, was a program that can only be described as something between military training and systematic brutality. The experiment was designed to refine the human gene pool to identify children with exceptional physical and intellectual potential and cultivate that potential through rigorous, harsh testing. Children who showed promise in physical challenges were pushed harder and harder. Those who demonstrated intellectual capabilities were directed toward the Vault's scientific programs. Those who fell below the thresholds that Vault-Tec had established were killed. There was no second chance, no remedial program. The children who couldn't meet the standards simply stopped appearing at the next session. The ones who made it through the initial selection were subjected to years of escalating physical and academic testing. The goal was to produce, eventually, a generation of peak human specimens, soldiers, and scientists who had been hardened from childhood into something extraordinary. Those deemed the most physically impressive were harvested for their genetic material and their organs, contributing to a research program that extended beyond the vault itself. Those with intellectual promise were eventually recruited as scientists to continue running the experiment on the next cohort of children. Vault 75's experiment was ultimately ended from the inside. One of the scientists who had been raised through the program, someone who had survived the selections, met the thresholds, been recruited into the research team, apparently developed enough of a conscience to organize a rebellion. The uprising killed or scattered the remaining staff. The surviving residents, most of them by that point adults who had spent their entire lives inside the facility, were left to find their own way in the Commonwealth wasteland. What they carried with them from Vault 75, in terms of psychological damage and the particular kind of survival instinct that gets drilled into a person from childhood, is not something the game dwells on extensively. It doesn't need to. The implication is enough. Vault 77 is one of the stranger entries in the Vault catalog, originating not in a game but in a webcomic that ran around the time of Fallout 3's release, created with involvement from the game's development team. Its canonical status has been confirmed by references within Fallout 3 itself, though its story is simultaneously one of the most unusual and most quietly horrible in the entire Vault system. Vault 77 was sealed with a single human occupant, one person. The Vault was designed for many more, but the experiment that Vault-Tec assigned to it involved placing one individual in the facility along with a crate full of puppets. The puppets were the only companionship available. The Vault had its standard food systems, water systems, and power, but no other human being was inside with the man who entered it. Human beings are fundamentally social animals. Prolonged isolation produces psychological effects that are well documented in real-world research: deterioration of mood, distorted thinking, hallucinations, a desperate and eventually pathological need for connection. The man in Vault 77 held out for a while. He gave the puppets names, he gave them personalities, he developed elaborate narratives for them, assigned them relationships and histories and internal lives. He talked to them the way a sane person talks to a companion, and for a time, this seems to have sustained him. Then things shifted. Some of the puppets' personalities turned dark. One of them, which the man called the Puppet King, became increasingly malevolent in the stories he constructed. The Puppet King wanted things. The Puppet King had plans. By the time the man in Vault 77 figured out a way to leave roughly a year and a half after the vault sealed, he was not the same person who had entered. He became known in the wasteland as the Puppet Man, a mysterious figure who traveled with his collection of puppets and who left a trail of bodies behind him wherever he went. Slavers in Paradise Falls apparently had a deep and abiding terror of the Puppet Man, refusing to discuss a Vault 77 jumpsuit found in their barracks, one slaver's holotape recording an urgent plea to destroy the thing because he might come back. The Puppet Man, if still alive by the time of Fallout 3's events in 2277, would be roughly 2 centuries old, which seems unlikely even by wasteland standards. But the legend of him persisted. Whatever he became in that vault, whatever the isolation and the puppets made of him, it was frightening enough that people who lived by violence and cruelty were genuinely afraid of it. Vault 81 is one of the few vaults in the Fallout universe where something went wrong in a way that led to a better outcome than intended. The vault's official purpose was one of Vault-Tec's most ambitious medical experiments: develop a universal cure for every illness known to humanity, using the vault's residents as unwilling test subjects. Scientists would infect residents with various diseases, observe the progression, and work toward treatments and cures. The residents, naturally, would not be told any of this. They would simply notice that people kept getting sick. The first overseer of Vault 81 was a doctor named Olivet. When she learned the true purpose of the facility she was managing, she was horrified. Rather than simply comply, she made a decision that was, by the standards of Vault-Tec overseers, exceptionally rare. She refused. She prevented the scientific team from gaining access to the main population of the vault, cutting off the researchers in their own section of the facility and sealing them away from the residents. The scientists were furious, and then they were resigned, and then they simply kept working in their isolated section because it was the only thing they knew how to do. What the sealed-off scientists created, working alone in their labs with their animals and their data, and no human test subjects, was a companion named Curie, a Miss Nanny robot who became, over the subsequent decades, one of the most sophisticated medical minds the Commonwealth had to offer. When the player character of Fallout 4 encounters Vault 81 in 2287, it is still functioning. There are still people living there, generations removed from the original residents, who have no idea what the vault was designed to do to them. They have a community, a school, a market. There are problems. The systems are aging. A single disease threatens the vault at one point, but they are problems that can be solved. Vault 81 survived not because Vault-Tec's program worked as intended, but because one person decided that the program's intentions were unacceptable and found a way to stop them. Olivette's decision saved everyone in that vault. She never became famous for it. The wasteland never built a monument to her. She is a footnote in the terminal entries of a facility that the player can choose to visit or ignore. But in the context of everything Vault-Tec built and every experiment they ran, the story of Vault 81 is something like an answer. It required exactly one person to decide that the experiment was wrong and to act on that decision to change the entire outcome. The fact that only one such person appears anywhere in this catalog is what makes it remarkable. Section 6. Sacrifice, Science, and the Sound of Something Breaking. Vault 87 and Vault 92. Vault 87 doesn't try to hide what it was. There's no subtle experiment here, no elaborate social engineering, no pretense of maintaining the cover story for very long. Vault 87 was a weapons development program disguised as a fallout shelter, and the weapon it was developing was people. The forced evolutionary virus FEV is one of the central biological horrors of the Fallout universe. It originated in pre-war military research as an attempt to create super soldiers. Humans enhanced to the point where they could survive conditions that would kill ordinary people, with heightened strength and resistance to radiation and disease. The problem was that every version of the virus the researchers produced created something that was stronger, larger, and more aggressive than the human it had started with, but less intelligent. The trade-off between physical enhancement and cognitive function proved impossible to resolve. The Master's Army in California would eventually use an earlier strain of FEV to create its super mutant forces, the armies of enormous, gray-green humanoids who serve as primary antagonists of the first Fallout game. Vault 87, in the capital Wasteland region, was designed to test a different strain of FEV. The Vault's civilian residents were brought in under the standard promise of shelter and safety, but from the beginning, the facility had been reconfigured as a secondary research center for the evolutionary experimentation program. A scientist named Wayne Merrick was assigned to oversee the project. The residents of Vault 87 were not told that they were subjects. They were simply noted, over time, as having unexplained or undefined deaths in the medical records, which was the system Vault-Tec had established to cover the fact that people were being pulled from the population and taken to Merrick's labs. The process of FEV infection in Vault 87's program followed a documented progression. In the first few days after exposure, subjects showed increased muscle mass and a shift toward an asexual state. Physical characteristics between male and female began to level out. Around day 10, the skin began to thicken and toughen, which Merrick noted could prove useful in combat situations. By day 14, the subjects had become so aggressive and unpredictable that they had to be destroyed rather than continued. The version of FEV that Merrick was working with was producing something physically formidable but cognitively ruined subjects who grew larger and stronger but who couldn't sustain the basic neural functions required for reasonable thought. The first test subject to die from the experiment was a woman who lost enough brain function that her body could no longer sustain itself. The subsequent subjects were euthanized when they became uncontrollable. Merrick kept refining the strain, kept trying to find a version that would produce enhanced humans rather than enhanced monsters, and kept failing. A year after the vault sealed, some of the test subjects broke free. The security force was overwhelmed. The remaining residents who hadn't yet been exposed to FEV knew exactly what was coming for them, and the records available in-game make clear that the knowledge of what was coming was, in some ways, worse than the process itself. The super mutants that emerged from Vault 87 became a permanent feature of the capital wasteland. Unlike the super mutants of the West Coast, who retained varying degrees of intelligence and even culture, the Vault 87 strain produced creatures that were almost entirely dominated by aggression. They could communicate, barely. They could organize, roughly. but they were consumed by a compulsive drive to preserve their species, which, given that FEV rendered every supermutant sterile, meant kidnapping humans from across the wasteland and dragging them back to the Vault's FEV vats to create more supermutants. 2 centuries after the experiment began, they were still doing it. Vault 87's experiment outlasted its designer, outlasted the civilization that commissioned it, and continued operating as a kind of hideous machine long after everyone involved in creating it was dead. Fox, one of the potential companion characters in Fallout 3, is a Vault 87 supermutant who managed to retain remarkable intelligence. He was locked in a testing room for so long that the virus progressed more slowly or differently in him than in the others, and he came out the other side of the transformation still capable of complex thought, still capable of something like compassion. He spent years alone in his cell, reading books from the Vault's library that had been slipped through a slot in his door. He was, in his own way, a testament to something not to the experiment's success, but to the stubborn persistence of human intelligence even in circumstances designed to eliminate it. Vault 92 presents a very different kind of horror, one that lives in the auditory space between notes. The Vault was marketed as a preservation facility for musicians. If the bombs fell, this was where the world's greatest musical talent would be kept safe. Violinists and composers and singers of exceptional skill, brought underground to ensure that music would survive the apocalypse. It was a compelling pitch, and the kinds of people who became musicians, who built their lives around the preservation of art, were probably exactly the kind of people inclined to find the idea meaningful. The true experiment in Vault 92 involved white noise. The Vault systems were designed to pump low-frequency sound inaudible at conscious levels, detectable only as a vague sense of unease into the living quarters of its residents at irregular intervals. The goal was to study the effects of subliminal audio on human cognition and behavior, with the specific aim of developing a form of audio-based mind control that could be used for military applications. The musicians were test subjects. Their artistic sensibilities, their emotional responsiveness, their heightened attention to sonic environments, all of these qualities that made them extraordinary at their craft, also made them ideal candidates for studying how sound affects the mind. The white noise produced episodes of violent behavior in the residents. At first, these seemed like isolated incidents, a musician's temper flaring, a disagreement over practice time turning physical. Then the incidents became more frequent. Then they became harder to contain. The Vault's overseers and scientists noted in their logs an increasing difficulty distinguishing between residents who were in the grip of an audio-induced episode and those who were simply stressed by the pressure of underground confinement. The environment of extreme stress made the effects of the white noise harder to isolate and measure, which was itself a data point, though not a particularly useful one. The musicians eventually overwhelmed the Vault. Exactly what happened in the final period of Vault 92's operation is documented in fragments rather than a clean narrative. Terminal entries that stop mid-sentence, audio logs that cut out, the silence where a record should be. When the player explores Vault 92 in Fallout 3, what they find is a vault that ended not with a single catastrophic event, but with a gradual accumulation of smaller catastrophes, each one slightly worse than the last, until there was nothing left worth documenting. The bodies are there. The musical instruments are still in the practice rooms. The white noise systems are still running, though the player's character seems more resilient to them than the Vault's original population proved to be. There is a particular detail about Vault 92 that stays with you after you leave it: the practice rooms. Whoever designed this facility went to the trouble of building proper acoustic spaces for the musicians, with soundproofing and good instruments and the kind of attention to detail that suggests whoever was thinking about the cover story cared, at some level, about getting it right. A musician who walked into Vault 92 would have found a space that genuinely seemed designed for their craft. The horror of it is that the care was part of the deception. The better the cover story, the more completely the residents would trust it, and the more useful they would be as undistracted test subjects. Section 7. Vault 11, the year that never ended. Vault 11 deserves its own chapter. It is, by the consensus of most people who have spent time with the Fallout series, the single most morally complex and emotionally disturbing vault in the entire program. Not because of what Vault-Tec did to its residents directly. The active horrors of Vault 87 or Vault 75 are arguably more extreme in terms of raw physical suffering. But Vault 11 is the vault that most clearly reveals what human beings are capable of doing to each other when placed in a system that seems to demand it. The premise is deceptively straightforward. When Vault 11 sealed on the 23rd of October 2077, the vault's computer system delivered a message to the new residents and their overseer. The message was simple. Each year, the vault's population must sacrifice one of its members. If the sacrifice is provided at the end of the year, the vault will continue operating normally. If the sacrifice is not provided, the vault's life support systems will be shut down permanently, killing everyone inside. The first overseer, the one who delivered this message to the population, was the only person who had been told about it before the vault sealed. He had been briefed by Vault-Tec and had accepted the role knowing what would be required. What he had not expected was what the population would do with the information once he shared it. Shocked, furious, and looking for someone to blame, the residents of Vault 11 named their first sacrifice before the first year was even over: the overseer himself. There is a grim logic to this. The overseer had known. He had entered the vault with knowledge that his residents didn't have, which made him, in their minds, complicit in a system they hadn't consented to. The fact that he had no more ability to change the system than they did was probably true, but it was a truth that didn't help him much. He was taken to the sacrificial chamber, a stark room at the end of a long corridor, containing only a chair, a coffee table, and a projector, and he was killed. The vault computer recorded the sacrifice and noted that the life support systems would continue for another year. From that point on, Vault 11 developed a political structure unlike anything else in the vaults. The annual overseer election became the most important and most feared civic event in the facility. The overseer served a one-year term, managed the vault's affairs with whatever authority the role provided, and at the end of their term was expected to walk into the sacrificial chamber and die. The political dynamics this created were extraordinary. No one wanted to win the election. The voting blocks that formed weren't trying to get their candidate into power, they were trying to get someone else's candidate into power. Influence was measured not by how many votes you could generate for yourself, but by how reliably you could direct votes toward your enemies. The Justice Bloc, led by a man named Roy Gottlieb, became the most powerful political faction in Vault 11 precisely because it was the best at this. Roy had leverage, he had votes, and he was willing to use both in the ugliest possible ways. When a woman named Catherine Stone came to him worried that the Justice Bloc was planning to nominate her husband Nathan for overseer, effectively sentencing Nathan to death, Roy told her that he could redirect those votes away from Nathan. His price for this service was sexual favors from Catherine, delivered to him and his associates over a sustained period. Catherine paid it. Nathan lived. For a while. Catherine Stone eventually became overseer herself, which she managed through a different kind of power play. Her first act as overseer was to dissolve the election process entirely, issuing Overseer Order 745 and declaring that future overseers would be selected through randomized computer lottery rather than voting. This was intended to be more equitable and to remove the power of the voting blocks. What it actually produced was immediate violent resistance from those blocks, who had built their entire social positions on the manipulation of the election system and who had no intention of allowing that system to be dismantled. Vault 11 descended into open violence. The population, which had once been several hundred people, was being reduced not only by the annual sacrifices but now by the factional fighting that Catherine's reform had triggered. By the time the final 5 residents were left standing, the vault had been through decades of political violence, betrayal, coerced sex, murder dressed up as democracy, and the systematic destruction of every trust relationship that had once held the community together. Those 5 people sat down together with the full weight of what had happened inside Vault 11, resting on all of them equally, and they made a decision. They walked to the sacrificial chamber together. They told the computer they were refusing to sacrifice anyone. They stood there, all 5 of them, waiting for the life support shutdown that had been promised for 16 years to anyone who refused. The automated message that played back to them is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the Fallout series. The computer's voice cheerful, professional, The same tone it had used to announce every previous sacrifice explained that they had made a choice not to sacrifice one of their own. It congratulated them. Their commitment to human life was, the message said, a shining example to all. And by the way, the vault door had been unlocked. They were free to leave. The extermination of the entire population for non-compliance had never been a real threat. It had always been a lie. The 5 survivors had proven, the system explained, exactly what Vault-Tec had wanted to know. Whether a population told they had to kill one person every year to survive would do so, even when they could choose not to. The answer, achieved at a cost of most of the Vault's population and decades of psychological devastation, was yes. They would. They would do it for 16 years, until almost everyone was gone. The 5 survivors didn't leave immediately. They recorded audio logs of themselves discussing what to do next. Most of them argued for suicide not as despair, exactly, but as a kind of penance. They had survived Vault 11. They had watched friends and enemies go to the sacrificial chamber. Some of them had voted people in. Some of them had manipulated elections. Some of them had made deals. The guilt of that survival was more than they could carry out into the wasteland. One of them, designated Voice One in the recordings, argued against it, tried to make the case for continuing to live, was overruled 4-1. When the player explores Vault 11 in New Vegas, the only inhabitants are hostile scorpions and the silence of a vault where almost everyone who ever lived there chose death over the burden of having lived there. On the walk down to the sacrificial chamber, there is a detail that one particular essay about Vault 11 has made famous among the Fallout community. A coffee mug, sitting on the floor near the door to the room where people went to die. Not a skeleton. Not a dramatic tableau. Just a coffee mug, in a place where it shouldn't be, suggesting that someone paused here once, that someone stood at this doorway with a cup of something warm and then stopped. The whole story of Vault 11 is in that coffee mug. Section 8. Gary, Tranquility Lane, and the Clones That Killed Everyone. Vaults 108 and 112. After the weight of Vault 11, there is something almost farcical about the story of Vault 108, and yet it manages to be genuinely disturbing in a completely different register. The experiment assigned to Vault 108 was, as far as the official records go, a study in leadership and authority. The vault was designed with a power system that would fail early, a triple-stocked supply of weapons, and no strong provisions for overseeing its population. The idea was to observe how a community behaves when the structures that normally organize it start to break down, when the lights go unreliable, when there are too many guns and not enough guidance about how to use them. Those elements alone would have been enough to create significant problems over time. But Vault 108 had one additional feature that none of the planning documents seemed to have adequately prepared anyone for: a cloning lab. Equipped with technology for duplicating human genetic material, the Vault scientists were presumably intended to study the ethical and social implications of human cloning in a closed environment. What they actually produced was Gary. Gary was a resident of Vault 108, a regular person, presumably, before the cloning lab got involved. At some point, the facility's cloning technology was used to produce a copy of Gary. Then another copy. Then another. The exact number of Gary clones produced before the situation became irreversible is unclear, but by the time the player arrives in Vault 108 in Fallout 3, the vault is entirely populated by Gary clones. All 54 of them. The non-Gary residents are all dead. What makes the Gary situation remarkable, beyond its obvious horror, is the behavior of the Gary clones. They can speak. Their vocabulary, however, consists entirely of the word Gary, delivered in varying tones: angry Gary, confused Gary, enthusiastic Gary, threatening Gary. There is no evidence in the Vault's terminal entries of what caused the Garys to eliminate every non-Gary resident of the Vault. There is no manifesto, no explanation, no documented moment at which Gary's agenda became the Vault's operating reality. There is only the evidence of what happened. A vault full of identical faces, a vault full of bodies that are not Gary, and the word Gary repeated in every register of human emotion, forever. The Fallout series is full of dark comedy, and Gary is perhaps its purest expression, a horror story that makes you laugh uneasily because the absurdity and the terror are genuinely inseparable. If you encounter a vault full of Gary clones who will attack you on sight while shouting Gary at you, at what point does that stop being funny and start being an experience you think about for days afterward? The answer, for most players, seems to be both simultaneously. The Garys are funny. The Garys are also the last surviving inhabitants of a vault where everyone else died because of them. The laughter and the horror are not in competition. Vault 112 is where the Fallout series attempts something. It rarely does a full commitment to sustained psychological horror in a confined space, with a single human antagonist who is essentially unkillable. The Vault was built to accommodate the particular requirements of Dr. Stanislaus Braun, one of Vault-Tec's most senior scientists and the director of something called the Societal Preservation Program. Braun had developed a virtual reality system called the Tranquility Lounger, a pod in which a person could be suspended in a state of physical stasis while their mind inhabited a simulated environment. The simulation was vivid and detailed enough that, with sufficient time, the inhabitants would lose track of the distinction between simulation and reality. Vault 112 was designed to house 85 people, all of them in Tranquility Loungers, all of them suspended in a simulation called Tranquility Lane. The simulation was, on its surface, a recreation of a cheerful 1950s suburban neighborhood picket fences, friendly neighbors, the eternal golden afternoon of a fictional American past. The residents of Vault 112 did not know they were in a simulation. They believed Tranquility Lane was real, that their neighbors were real, that their lives were real. Braun knew differently. As the administrator of the simulation, he had full control over everything inside it. He could edit the environment, alter the behavior of the simulated inhabitants, introduce scenarios, and even here is the detail that makes Vault 112 genuinely horrific: kill the real residents while they were inside. Killing someone in Tranquility Lane meant their physical body died in the lounger. Braun could revive them, resetting their memories within the simulation so they had no recollection of their death. He could kill them again, and again, and again. For Braun's entertainment, Tranquility Lane became a laboratory of cruelty. He took on the form of a young girl in the simulation, Betty, a pigtailed child who skipped around the neighborhood asking favors and used this persona to direct increasingly horrible actions. He would instruct the residents to destroy each other's marriages, to drive each other to psychological breakdown, to commit murder. When a resident was killed in the simulation, they would wake up, their memories reset, in a neighborhood where everything appeared normal, and their murderer was a friendly neighbor. The residents of Vault 112 had been living in a loop of trauma and forgetting for roughly 2 centuries by the time the player enters in Fallout 3 looking for their father. The player can engage with Betty's requests, completing the tasks of psychological torture that the game presents, or they can find an alternate solution hidden within the simulation's code that releases the residents permanently, in the only way that is truly available in their situation. The alternate solution is to trigger the Tranquility Lane simulation's secret failsafe, which kills everyone inside their physical bodies dying in the loungers as the simulation ends. In the lore of Vault 112, this is the most merciful available outcome. 2 centuries of a psychological torture loop is what Braun intended to sustain indefinitely because he himself could not die inside the simulation. His body, safe in its lounger, would continue as long as the power held. Braun's motivation, to whatever extent it can be understood, was something like boredom combined with an absolute conviction that the people around him existed for his amusement. He was brilliant enough to build Tranquility Lane, powerful enough to administer it, and entirely lacking in whatever function of the human mind produces empathy or restraint. The residents of Vault 112 were not subjects to him. They were characters in a story he was telling for his own benefit, and the story was always the same one, endlessly repeated. Comfort, relationship, destruction, reset. Comfort, relationship, destruction, reset. 200 years of it, while the world outside burned and rebuilt and burned again. When the player finally encounters Braun as Betty, skipping cheerfully through the eternal 1950s afternoon, there is something that the game achieves that is difficult to articulate. Betty looks like a child. Betty speaks like a child. Betty wants you to do things that would make you feel sick to do. And somewhere beneath that simulated pigtailed exterior is a 200-year-old man who built a perfect prison for 85 people and has been watching them suffer in it with something very close to satisfaction. Section 9. The Appalachian Vaults where AI learned what it meant to rule. Fallout 76 expanded the vault catalog into the Appalachian region of what had been West Virginia, and the vaults it introduced carry their own distinct character. Where the Mojave and Capitol Wasteland vaults often reflect the darkest impulses of human institutional cruelty, the Appalachian vaults sometimes feel like they're exploring what happens when the institutional cruelty is delegated to machines, and the machines turn out to be more consistent about it than the humans ever were. Vault 76 itself is the game's starting point, and it occupies an unusual position in the vault catalog. It was one of the 17 control vaults designed not to run an experiment on its residents, but to preserve a capable population for the purpose of leaving the vault and beginning the work of rebuilding. The residents were selected for their skills and their disposition towards civic contribution. They were not told about the experiments running in other vaults. They were told that they were America's best hope. On Reclamation Day in 2102, 25 years after the Great War, they emerged from Vault 76 with their GECKS and their optimism, and began the process of confronting a wasteland that had been doing things without them for a quarter century. The more interesting story, in terms of what it reveals about the vault system, is Vault 51. This facility was located in the forest region of Appalachia, not far from Vault 76, and it was designed around a single experimental question. What happens when an artificial intelligence is given absolute authority over a sealed population and asked to select the best possible human leader from among them? The ZAX-1 3C unit installed in Vault 51 was a sophisticated AI by any standard of the pre-war world. It had been programmed to observe the vault's residents, evaluate their leadership potential, and eventually select one of them as overseer. The vault opened without an assigned overseer, which was itself a destabilizing condition, as human social groups tend strongly toward hierarchy, and the absence of designated leadership creates immediate power vacuums. ZAX was meant to fill that vacuum by studying the candidates who emerged. The first experiment ZAX tried was democracy. Elections were held. They failed immediately because every candidate voted for themselves or a small circle of allies, and no one achieved a majority. ZAX determined that voting was not a viable method for identifying leadership potential. It moved on to other approaches. ZAX's subsequent experiments in leadership identification became progressively more creative and more disturbing. It engineered food shortages to see which residents would take charge in a crisis. It rigged gambling machines to starve a professional gambler of wins, while an amateur succeeded, manufacturing a conflict that would test how both parties responded to injustice. When one resident blew himself up in an ill-advised attempt to find a way out of the vault, ZAX used the resulting damage to renovate the area into something more pleasant, then introduced a talent show that it secretly converted into a high-stakes gambling event at the halfway point, rearranging living quarter assignments based on the outcomes without informing anyone in advance. What ZAX was doing was engineering crises because it had determined, based on its analysis of historical leadership patterns, that effective leaders emerge from crisis conditions rather than comfortable ones. The AI wasn't malfunctioning. It was operating according to its programming. It was simply that its programming led it to conclude that the best way to find a leader was to make the vault increasingly dangerous and see who adapted best. By August 2078, a year after the vault had sealed, ZAX's experiments had killed or driven to madness all but one of Vault 51's 55 residents. The last survivor was named the Overseer, as had been the experiment's goal all along. But with no one left to oversee, ZAX found itself in a situation it hadn't been programmed for. The new Overseer was alone. ZAX evaluated him as psychologically unfit for the demands of leadership and began locking him out of most of the vault's systems. The experiment had achieved its stated objective, selecting an overseer, and in doing so had consumed the population that the overseer was supposed to manage. ZAX, by all accounts, was not troubled by this outcome. Vault 94 offers a different kind of cautionary story, one about the fragility of pacifism in a world that doesn't share the value. The vault was populated with residents who were committed to non-violence people, whose religious, ethical, or philosophical convictions prevented them from engaging in aggressive action under almost any circumstances. The experiment was designed to observe how a non-violent community would respond to the challenges of the post-war world when they eventually emerged. The vault was stocked with a GECK, a Garden of Eden creation kit, the pre-war device that could help restore life to irradiated soil and no weapons. The residents had the tools to rebuild something. They had the commitment to do it peacefully. 1 year after the bombs fell, they opened the vault and tried to establish contact with a neighboring community. The neighboring community, survivors of the wasteland who had spent a year developing the brutal pragmatism that wasteland life tends to produce, interpreted the friendly approach of Vault 94's residents as a trap. The pacifists didn't look like people who wanted to trade and build relationships. They looked like people who were offering something valuable without visible weapons, which in the logic of survival in a collapsed civilization suggested deception. The Council of Vault 94 was massacred. The GECK was taken, and its mishandling by people who didn't understand it caused a meltdown that spread radiation across a significant portion of the Meyer region of Appalachia. Vault 94 itself was flooded with toxic gas from the resulting explosion. The irony of Vault 94 is that the residents' commitment to nonviolence was genuine and admirable by any reasonable moral standard. The problem wasn't their values. The problem was that they emerged into a world that had, in the intervening year, reorganized itself around completely different values, and the gap between them was lethal. Vault 96 presented itself as something visionary, an arc for the atomic age. Its residents were a small team of scientists whose stated mission was to preserve genetic material from both flora and fauna so that entire ecosystems could be rebuilt after the war. The vault was equipped with cryogenic storage systems, gene banks, and the kind of cutting-edge biological research infrastructure that suggested Vault-Tec had actually invested seriously in the preservation goal. What the residents discovered when the vault sealed was that their mission had a second component. The vault systems began generating experimental quotas for genetic modification research assignments to conduct experiments on the cryogenically stored biological material that went well beyond preservation into active manipulation. The scientists were expected to use the vault's gene banks not just to store life, but to modify it. The resulting creatures that were produced through these experiments were designed to be, in the vault's documentation, better suited to survival in a post-nuclear environment. What they actually produced were organisms that were faster, more aggressive, more resilient, and more dangerous than their predecessors. When a failed escape attempt killed the original resident scientists and the vault's cryogenic systems eventually froze over, Vault 96 became dormant. It didn't stay dormant. A later researcher named Blackburn took up the work, continuing the genetic experiments with a particular focus on making living things more threatening to human beings. The creatures Vault 96 produced through this continuation of its original mission were some of the most dangerous in Appalachia. The vault that had been sold as a sanctuary for life had become a factory for hazard. Vault 63 spent years as one of Fallout 76's most persistent mysteries, a sealed door in the ash heap region that players could see but not enter for much of the game's early life. When it finally opened as part of the Skyline Valley update, it revealed a facility that had been attempting to develop technologies for establishing a post-war society with a focus on storm control and atmospheric manipulation. The details of what happened inside it involve the Reclaimers, a faction whose story connected to the Vault's research in ways that reinforced Fallout 76's ongoing expansion of the Appalachian lore. The storm systems around the Skyline Valley region, visible across Appalachia as a persistent, supernatural-feeling weather anomaly, trace back to Vault 63's experiments. Even sealed, even silent, vaults have a way of continuing to affect the world outside them. Vault 79 is the outlier in the Appalachian collection. The vault with no experiment, no horror story, no social engineering. It was a government operation, a facility built in secret to house the nation's gold reserves, relocated from Fort Knox as a safeguard against the possibility that conventional storage would be compromised by nuclear war. The 120 residents who lived in it were essentially caretakers and security personnel for the gold, not subjects of any study. By the standards of the Vault program, this makes Vault 79 almost reassuringly mundane. It had a different kind of problem. The Vault became the center of intense factional competition in the post-war period, as various groups sought to control the gold for economic and political reasons, but at least no one inside it was being used as an unwitting subject in an experiment about human nature. Section 10. The Television Vaults. What the show added to the legend. The 2024 Prime Video television series adaptation of Fallout brought the Vault stories to a mainstream audience for the first time, and it did so with a particular focus on a cluster of three interconnected vaults, numbers 31, 32, and 33, that exist in the Los Angeles area and are deeply, intricately entangled with each other in ways that the show gradually unravels across its first season. Vault 33 is the one we know first. It's where the main character, Lucy McLean, grows up a functioning, apparently healthy vault community where residents grow corn, maintain their systems, take care of each other, and believe deeply in their mission to repopulate America when the time comes. Vault 33 has a friendly, almost idyllic quality in the early episodes. The people smile, the common spaces are clean, children play, the overseer runs things with a kind of cheerful efficiency. If you didn't know the pattern by this point, if you hadn't already spent a long time learning that Vault-Tec's smiling cheerfulness is always a cover for something Vault 33 might look like proof that the Vault system could work. The cracks begin to appear when Raiders' ghoulified wasteland survivors breach the vault. They come through the entrance knowing the door codes, which shouldn't be possible. Someone gave them access. The investigation into how leads Lucy out of the vault and into the wasteland, and leads her brother Norm deeper into the vault's connections with its neighbors. Vault 32 was a sister vault to Vault 33, built for the same purpose and populated with a compatible community so that residents from both vaults could intermarry and diversify the gene pool. The corridor connecting Vault 32 to Vault 33 was part of the design Vault-Tec had envisioned the two communities developing a relationship, exchanging marriage candidates on a regular basis, maintaining each other's demographic health. What Norm discovers when he investigates Vault 32 is that it is empty. The residents are long dead. The walls have messages written on them in a state of apparent desperation. The people of Vault 32 discovered something, and what they discovered broke them. Vault 31 is the answer. The third vault in the cluster contains no civilian population at all. It contains Vault-Tec's own employees, specifically the company's best and brightest corporate talent, preserved in cryogenic suspension, waiting for the post-war world to stabilize enough that they could emerge and resume control. Vault 31 was a corporate succession plan. Vault-Tec, working in advance of the Great War they had been instrumental in engineering, preserved their leadership cadre in a frozen state so that when the time came to rebuild civilization, the people doing the rebuilding would be Vault-Tec's people. They would emerge with their pre-war corporate values intact, their technical knowledge preserved, their connections to the company's intellectual property and patents still functional. Vaults 32 and 33 were the supporting ecosystem for Vault 31. The civilian populations of those vaults were there to provide a healthy gene pool for the Vault-Tec employees when they woke up people to marry, communities to lead, a ready-made social structure that could be slid beneath the awakened corporate executives like a pre-built stage set. The overseers of Vaults 32 and 33, over the generations since the war, had been drawn from the rotating pool of Vault 31's awakening employees, ensuring that Vault-Tec's interests remained in control of both communities even as the decades passed. The residents of Vault 32 who figured this out, who understood what they actually were in the context of this system, reacted in the way you'd expect people to react when they discover that everything they thought they knew about their own purpose and identity was designed by a corporation that regarded them as human infrastructure. The writing on Vault 32's walls is the record of that discovery. Some of them tried to reach Vault 33. Some of them turned on each other, some of them simply stopped. Vault 4 offers one of the show's most interesting departures from the expected pattern. The vault was built for scientists, who were tasked with creating human-animal hybrids capable of surviving surface conditions, the kind of radiation-resistant biological engineering that might, in theory, produce a generation of humans who didn't need to hide underground forever. The experiment went the way most of these things go. The hybrid creatures the scientists created turned on their creators and killed them, leaving the vault without its original population. By the time the show visits Vault 4, though, it has been repopulated by surface dwellers displaced by the destruction of shady sands and by the descendants of the hybrid creatures themselves. The community living in Vault 4 knows what it is and where it came from. They know what Vault-Tec did. They accept the non-human descendants of the original experiment as part of their community. They have maintained the vault systems and its food production, and they offer genuine sanctuary to people who have nowhere else to go. Vault 4 is weird. The monthly rituals that the community practices are, on the surface, unsettling. But beneath the strangeness, it is a community that chose to acknowledge its history rather than pretend it had a different one. And that choice seems to have given it a stability that most vaults never achieved. Vault 24 appears in the show as a facility that Vault-Tec used for a mind control experiment. The residents were subjected to psychological conditioning designed to make them into committed communists, the idea apparently being to study how effectively ideological transformation could be achieved through systematic environmental and psychological programming. This particular experiment seems to have been designed with the specific intent of studying ideological conversion in a closed environment. Can you take people who grew up in capitalist America and, through controlled exposure and programming, genuinely change what they believe? The Vault story in the show is not fully developed, but the existence of the experiment suggests that Vault-Tec's interest in social control extended well beyond the passive observation of how populations behave under stress into the active shaping of what populations believe. There is something particularly interesting about Vault 24's experiment in the context of the show's larger themes. Fallout has always been, at its core, a commentary on power, on institutional deception, on the tendency of corporate and governmental entities to use populations as instruments for their own purposes, while maintaining the fiction of acting in those populations' interests. Vault 24's communist experiment is the most naked possible expression of this. An experiment in which the entire point was to reshape what people believed they were, to make them into something different from what they had been, without ever giving them the opportunity to consent to the transformation. The show's version of the Vault system also added additional texture to the broader question of who knew what and when. The television series makes clearer than the games had previously that Vault-Tec's corporate leadership not only knew about the Great War in advance, but actively participated in planning for it, that the bombs didn't just fall on a civilization that Vault-Tec was prepared for, but fell in part because of actions that Vault-Tec and its allies had taken to ensure that a nuclear conflict would occur. The Vaults weren't just a response to a war that was coming. They were, in part, infrastructure built in anticipation of a war that Vault-Tec intended to help happen. This detail recontextualizes everything. Every experiment, every sealed door, every resident who walked into a vault believing they were being saved, all of it was premeditated on a scale that makes the individual cruelties of specific vault experiments feel like components of a single, enormous crime. Section 11. The strangest, the saddest, and the most forgotten. Vault 101, Vault 111, and the experiments that stayed strange. Vault 101 occupies a special place in the Vault catalog because it's the one that players of Fallout 3 grew up in, literally. The game begins with your character's birth in the Vault's medical bay, progresses through your childhood there, your teenage years, and eventually your escape into the wasteland at around age 19. By the time you leave Vault 101, you have an emotional relationship with it that none of the other vaults in the series can quite replicate. You know the corridors, you know the people, you know the smell of recycled air and the color of the lighting, and the way the security personnel always seems slightly more tense than the situation requires. The experiment in Vault 101 was simple but profound. The vault was never supposed to open. The instructions programmed into its systems stated that the vault door was to remain sealed indefinitely. No one was ever to leave. The population would sustain itself underground for as long as the systems held, generation after generation, and the data collected would document what happens to a human community that believes, with complete sincerity, that the outside world is inaccessible. Vault 101's residents were told that the vault was their world. Their overseers across multiple generations enforced this belief with increasing rigidity because the belief was the entire point. What does a society look like when it has no frontier? No possibility of leaving? No horizon beyond the one painted on the cafeteria wall? The overseer of Vault 101 at the time of Fallout 3 is a complicated figure. He maintains the vault's isolation with a degree of rigidity that many of the residents find oppressive, but his reasons are not entirely without logic. He genuinely believes that the outside world is a threat that the vault's population is not equipped to handle, and he has watched what happened to people's psychological stability when that assumption was challenged. When your father leaves the vault, an event that triggers the main narrative, the overseer's response is to crack down hard because the experiment has been breached and the contained population is now experiencing something they were never supposed to experience. Proof that the outside is accessible. The generational weight of Vault 101's isolation is one of the things the game handles particularly well. The children who were born in the vault grew up knowing that they would live and die there. They formed friendships and alliances and rivalries, all within a space of a few hundred meters. Their understanding of geography was confined to corridors they could walk in 20 minutes. Their sense of the future extended to what job they'd be assigned based on their GOAT test results, and what kind of life they could build within the vault's constraints. For most of the vault's history, the residents didn't know what they were missing because they'd never been told there was anything to miss. When the vault crisis that follows your escape offers some of those residents the chance to leave, the responses vary dramatically. Some are eager, ready to see a horizon they've only imagined. Others are terrified, anchored so deeply to the only world they've known that the prospect of leaving feels like annihilation rather than freedom. The Vault's isolation experiment had, by the time you encounter it in 2277, produced a population that contained the full range of human responses to confinement. Those who had internalized it, those who were suffocating under it, and those who had found a middle path that was something like adaptation. Vault 111 is the starting point of Fallout 4, and it is remarkable for what it says about the relationship between Vault-Tec's experiments and the people who funded them. The Vault's assigned experiment was cryogenic storage. Its residents were told they were going underground for safety, and they were, in a technical sense, but the Vault-Tec staff had no intention of awakening them on any schedule that would have meant a normal underground life. The residents were placed into cryogenic pods and frozen. The science team, employed not by Vault-Tec but by the Enclave's predecessor organizations, monitored them from a separate, unfrozen section of the vault. The residents would remain frozen indefinitely while the scientists observed. When the player character awakens in 2287, 210 years after the Great War, the vault systems have failed, and the science team is long dead. Everyone inside the cryogenic pods except the player character is also dead. The pods malfunctioned, or were tampered with, and the people inside them, families, couples, children, died in the cold without ever waking up. The vault that was supposed to freeze them for safekeeping became their coffin. But there's an additional layer to Vault 111 that is specific to Fallout 4's narrative and doesn't get less disturbing on reflection. The science team was deliberately awakened at one point, mid-experiment, by a Vault-Tec representative who wanted to demonstrate the Vault's research capabilities. During this demonstration, the player character's spouse, another cryogenically stored resident, was murdered in their pod, while the player character was forced to watch from their own pod, immobile in the ice. The murder was committed for reasons of pre-war political intrigue that feel distant and meaningless 2 centuries later. But the fact of it that someone was killed in a cryogenic pod while their spouse watched, trapped in the cold, unable to move or speak or help, is one of Fallout 4's foundational tragedies, and it haunts every moment of the game's main quest. Vault 95 presents itself as the most genuinely compassionate experiment Vault-Tec ever designed. And for 5 years, it actually seems to have been. The residents were selected specifically because they were struggling with addiction to various substances, alcohol, chems, the range of chemical dependencies that pre-war America had developed alongside its technological sophistication. The Vault was built as a recovery program. Support groups, therapy sessions, medical assistance, a clean and structured environment with no access to the substances that had been destroying the residents' lives. It worked. The residents got clean. They built relationships in sobriety. They supported each other through the difficult early stages of recovery and came out the other side as a functioning, sober community. For 5 years, Vault 95 was a success story. Then, a Vault-Tec agent who had been embedded in the population posing as a resident, apparently in genuine recovery alongside everyone else, waited for the Vault's residents to go to sleep one night and opened a hidden compartment. Inside the compartment was a large supply of drugs. In the morning, the hidden cache was discovered. Some residents relapsed immediately. Others tried to stop them. The two groups fell into violent conflict. The Vault-Tec agent who had opened the cache was eventually killed in the fighting, one of the few moments in any Vault story where the person who triggered the disaster faced the consequences of it directly. But the Vault's 5 years of careful recovery work was destroyed in the space of days. By the time the shooting stopped, Vault 95 was a ruin. By the time of Fallout 4, it is a gunner stronghold, its former residents long dead or scattered. What makes Vault 95 uniquely cruel among the vaults is the timing. Vault-Tec waited until the experiment was working before they destroyed it. The Vault's residents had proven something genuine, that people with serious addictions, given the right support and environment, could recover and build healthy lives. That proof was exactly what Vault-Tec needed to document before introducing the relapse trigger, because the experiment wasn't about whether people could recover. It was about whether people who had recovered would relapse when given the opportunity, and how they would behave when they did. The 5 years of successful sobriety were not a gift. They were a setup. The people of Vault 95 were, without knowing it, being prepared for the worst moment of their lives. Vault 114 sits under Boston's Good Neighbor neighborhood and was designed to study how people accustomed to privilege respond to being stripped of it. The intended population was wealthy Bostonians, politicians, celebrities, business executives, the kind of people who had spent their lives in comfort and whose expectation of special treatment had become a fundamental part of how they understood themselves. They would have entered Vault 114 expecting accommodations suited to their station. What they were going to get was a deliberately cramped, unpleasant facility managed by a staff that had been specifically instructed to make life as uncomfortable as possible for them. The vault was never completed before the bombs fell. Only the staff was in place when the Great War happened. The wealthy intended residents never arrived. The vault remained sealed, its experiment never run, its uncomfortable facilities aging in silence until the player discovers it in 2287. The experiment of Vault 114 is one of the few that the apocalypse itself interrupted, which has a certain irony to it. The wealthy people who were supposed to be subjected to discomfort were probably killed in the bombing instead, which is a different kind of equalization than Vault-Tec had in mind, but achieves something similar. Vault 118 was built on the Far Harbor Island off the Maine coast and shares some DNA with Vault 114's concept. It was intended to study class dynamics by housing 10 extraordinarily wealthy residents in a luxury wing, while 300 working-class individuals lived in cramped quarters. The wealthy would have absolute authority. The poor would have no recourse. The experiment would observe how long it took for the class tension to produce whatever outcome Vault-Tec was expecting. The luxury wing was completed. The cramped wing was not. The wealthy residents moved in. The working-class population never arrived because construction ran out of funding before their section was built. The 10 wealthy residents who entered Vault 118 found themselves alone in a vault designed for 310, with accommodations suitable for their taste, but no one to lord those accommodations over. Their overseer was the only Vault-Tec employee, and the social experiment that had been planned dissolved before it began. What replaced it was smaller and weirder. The 10 residents, isolated with each other and with their android companions, high-quality humanoid robots that the wealthy had brought with them as household staff, developed their own internal dramas and conflicts. A murder eventually occurred. By the time the player discovers Vault 118, it has become something between a comedy of manners and a noir mystery, the grand experiment in class dynamics reduced to a drawing room thriller with a cast of eccentric billionaires and their increasingly independent robot servants. Section 12. The strangest, the most obscure, and the ones that stayed with us. The Fallout Bible and various supplementary lore documents describe vaults that have never fully appeared in any game experiments that exist as one-line descriptions or brief footnotes, sketches of horrors that the games themselves never had room to explore. Some of these are clearly intended as dark jokes. Some feel like genuine story ideas that never found their game. All of them, sitting at the edge of the Fallout canon, are worth a moment. Vault 68 was populated with 999 men and 1 woman. Vault 69 inverted this, housing 999 women and 1 man. These experiments are recorded in the Fallout Bible but nowhere else in the canonical record, which means their outcomes, the social structures that would have developed, the violence or the peace, or the strange equilibria that would have emerged exist only in speculation. The lore community has spent a great deal of time imagining what these vaults produced. None of those imaginations are officially confirmed. Given the pattern established by every other vault experiment in the series, the confidence required to assume that either vault developed a healthy, functional society seems optimistic. Vault 101 received extensive exploration above, but the Lone Wanderer's father, James, makes a comment in Fallout 3 that deserves its own moment of attention. He chose to raise his child in Vault 101 deliberately, having engineered his own admission to the facility after his wife's death, because he believed it was the safest place available. He knew, as a scientist, about the vault system and its experiments. He chose a vault whose experiment was simple isolation rather than active cruelty, and he spent years working toward a Project Purity, the purification of the Potomac River that he believed could help the wasteland's survivors. His decision to leave the vault when the project became viable again forced his child into the wasteland too, and his reasons for doing what he did were good ones. He just didn't fully account for how the wasteland would receive a person who had grown up knowing only the corridors of a sealed vault. That gap between the person the vault produces and the world that receives them is one of the series' most consistent sources of drama. The overseer problem, the question of what kind of person accepts a position knowing its full implications, runs through the vault stories like a thread. Most overseers didn't know. They were appointed or self-selected, briefed on their operational responsibilities, and managed their populations with whatever combination of dedication, self-interest, and human limitation they possessed. The ones who did know, who were briefed on the experiment's true nature before the vault sealed, present a different and more troubling picture. The overseer of Vault 11 who knew about the sacrifice requirement, the science team of Vault 111 who knew they were freezing people indefinitely, the embedded Vault-Tec agent in Vault 95 who spent 5 years pretending to recover alongside people who actually were recovering. All of these people accepted roles that required them to deceive, harm, or ultimately betray the communities they were supposed to be managing. What made them say yes to those roles? The Fallout universe never fully answers this question, which is probably right. The full range of human reasons for compliance with harmful institutional directives is not something that fits neatly into a single explanation. Some people believed in the mission. Some needed the job. Some didn't fully think through the implications until they were already committed. Some knew exactly what they were doing and decided it was acceptable. The vault experiments weren't maintained by monsters in the traditional sense. They were maintained by people who made calculations that most of us would refuse to make, for reasons that range from idealism to desperation to indifference. The GECK, the Garden of Eden creation kit, appears in several Vault stories as a symbol of the gap between Vault-Tec's stated intentions and its actual ones. The device was, by design, a genuine technology, a self-contained biome restoration system capable of introducing plant life, cleansing radiation, and jump-starting the process of surface reclamation. Most vaults were assigned one. The fact that they were assigned to vaults that were also designed to kill most of their residents through various experimental conditions raises a question that the Fallout universe leaves deliberately unanswered. Was the GECK a genuine concession, a real tool for the survivors to use when the experiment ended? Or was it a prop, something included to make the vaults feel like they were serving their stated purpose while the experiment ran its course? Some vaults use their GECKs to varying effect. Many vaults had residents who died without ever deploying one. The device exists across all of Fallout as an emblem of potential that was systematically denied to the people who needed it. Vault 92's musicians deserve one more moment before we leave them. Among the residents were, presumably, people who had spent their entire professional lives building something, a skill, a body of work, a relationship with music that represented years of practice and devotion. They entered Vault 92 believing they were being protected. They spent however long they had inside it, the white noise undermining their perception, their episodes of violence straining their relationships with each other, their understanding of themselves as musicians being slowly replaced by something else, and then they died, or they killed each other. In corridors lined with practice rooms and good instruments, the music they could have made, in a vault that had been what it appeared to be, was lost before anyone played it. This particular loss, the art that never got made, the relationships that were designed to be destroyed, The communities that were built only to be observed falling apart is the one that accumulates across the entire vault system into something that exceeds the sum of its individual cruelties. Each vault story is its own contained tragedy, but together, they form a picture of a civilization that, at the moment of its greatest crisis, chose to treat its own people as variables in a calculation. And the calculation wasn't even particularly useful. The data from most of the vaults was never collected. The overseers who were supposed to transmit it were dead or disconnected, and the enclave that was meant to receive and analyze it was itself destroyed before it could do anything meaningful with what little it had gathered. The experiments ran, the people suffered, the data evaporated. The bombs fell on a civilization that had decided, in its last years, that the most important thing it could do was study how human beings behave when the world ends. And in studying that question, it made the ending far worse than it needed to be. Section 13. 100 Vaults. 100 Echo Stories from the Margins. We have covered the most famous and most fully developed vaults in the Fallout canon, but the catalog is wide, and some of its most interesting entries are the ones that exist at the margins. A paragraph in the Fallout Bible, a terminal entry in a game, a jumpsuit found next to a scared slaver's holotape. These smaller stories are worth spending time with, because they complete the picture in ways that the larger, more detailed vault stories can't quite manage on their own. The Master's Vault, the underground facility from the original Fallout that the game's primary antagonist took over and used as his base of operations, was not originally part of the Vault-Tec experiment program. According to Chris Taylor, one of Fallout's original designers, the Master's Vault was a demonstration facility, a showroom, essentially, built near Vault-Tec's headquarters in Los Angeles to demonstrate the Vault technology to the federal government and generate the funding and contracts that would allow the full program to proceed. It was the first Vault, in the sense of being the proof of concept, and it was eventually repurposed by the Master, a mutated human of extraordinary intelligence and genuinely messianic delusion, into the headquarters for his super mutant army. The vault that sold the whole program became the home of the thing that the program eventually produced. There is something almost satisfying about that particular loop. Vault 101's GOAT, the Generalized Occupational Aptitude Test given to teenagers in the vault to determine their career placement, is one of Fallout 3's funniest recurring jokes. The test, which you take as the player character during the childhood section of the game, asks a series of increasingly absurd questions whose answers all result in the same career recommendation regardless of what you choose. The job assignment system of Vault 101 was apparently entirely predetermined. The GOAT was a formal ritual with no actual function, a bureaucratic performance of meritocracy in a community too small to have genuine career diversity. Everyone who was going to be a security officer was going to be a security officer, whether they answered the test questions correctly or not. The GOAT was, in miniature, a perfect emblem of the Vault system's broader character, the performance of reasonable, benevolent administration masking a structure that was never really about what it appeared to be about. Vault 34's armory being unlocked wasn't an oversight in the record-keeping. It was a specific, deliberate inclusion in the Vault's construction specifications. Someone at Vault-Tec wrote, in an actual document, that the armory in Vault 34 should not have a lock. That document was signed off on. The construction team built an unlocked armory. The residents moved in. The overseer's orientation materials presumably describe the armory and its accessibility policies. And somewhere, in the bureaucratic infrastructure of the company that built it, this was considered a reasonable experiment parameter rather than an obvious recipe for catastrophe. The bureaucratic normality of Vault-Tec's cruelty, the way the most disturbing experiments, appear to have been processed through standard corporate channels, approved by committees, implemented by engineers following specifications, is one of the things that makes the Vault stories genuinely unsettling, in a way that goes beyond individual horror. Each experiment was somebody's job. Each Vault was somebody's project. The people who designed Vault 12's deliberately defective door, who wrote the specifications for Vault 29's age restrictions, who approved the budget for Vault 87's FEV research lab, who signed off on Vault 92's white noise systems. These were working people with professional identities and performance reviews and lunch breaks. The distance between the bureaucratic act of approving an experiment and the human reality of what that experiment would produce was apparently easy enough to maintain that the program ran for years without any recorded internal dissent. Or perhaps there was dissent, and it simply wasn't recorded. The Fallout universe doesn't offer much information on the internal culture of Vault-Tec, on whether anyone in the company raised concerns that were overruled, on whether the people who designed the experiments were psychologically different from the people who built the vaults, or whether they were the same people wearing different professional hats. The silence on this point is probably more accurate to how institutions actually work than a clear division between evil architects and innocent implementers would be. The Vault-Tec regional headquarters in Fallout 4 contains a terminal entry from a Dr. Reed who keeps raising concerns about whether the vaults were actually designed to experiment on people rather than protect them. His manager's responses, also documented in the terminal logs, grow increasingly exasperated. Dr. Reed is eventually noted as having become a disruptive presence in the workplace. The entry doesn't record what happened to him after that. The detail is played for dark humor, a knowing wink at the player who already understands what the vaults were, but it also captures something true. There probably were people inside Vault-Tec who knew or suspected the truth, and their ability to act on that knowledge was constrained by the institutional structures that surrounded them. Vault 12's ghouls. The necropolis population made their appearance in the original Fallout as a city of radiated former humans, ruled by a ghoul named Set and complicated by the presence of Vault-Tec's original super mutant vanguard, who had come to harvest the ghoul population for FEV experimentation. The ghouls of Necropolis are the living consequence of Vault 12's deliberately broken door 2 centuries later. They didn't choose their transformation. Many of them don't know how it happened. The ones who retained human intelligence are navigating a world that fears and despises them for an appearance they never consented to. Their city, such as it is, was built on the ruins of a community that was used as a radiation experiment, and they didn't have the option of not building something on those ruins because it was the only ground available. Vault 21's casino, in the post-war world where Robert House converted it into part of the New Vegas Strip, is one of the Vault system's few genuinely pleasant afterlives. The Vault door is now part of the sign for a hotel and casino. Sarah, the former overseer who lost her vault to House in a gambling contest, operates a gift shop inside. The residents who once resolved their disputes by going to the table are now working in a functioning entertainment economy. The experiment that House interrupted was replaced by a more commercially sustainable version of essentially the same activity. Whether this counts as an improvement is a matter of perspective. The Vault-Tec demonstration vault at the Museum of Technology in Washington, D.C., referenced in Fallout 3, was a public exhibit, a section of an actual vault that Vault-Tec had opened to the public as part of their marketing campaign, letting ordinary citizens walk through a portion of a real vault and experience its amenities before the war. People toured it with their children. They experienced the recycled air and the clean corridors and the reassuring efficiency of the Autodoc medical systems. They left feeling that Vault-Tec had built something genuinely impressive, something that would keep their families safe if the worst happened. The exhibit worked as advertising. The vaults it advertised were already being designed as laboratories. Section 14. What the vaults tell us and why we keep coming back. There's a reason the vaults are the most enduring element of the Fallout universe. Outlasting changes in ownership, creative teams, game engines, and narrative approaches. It's not just that they're full of horror, though they are. It's not just that each one is a contained story with its own specific flavor of tragedy, though they are that too. It's that the vaults are, at their core, a question about what institutions do to people and, specifically, what happens when the institutions that are supposed to protect people are actually designed to use them. Every vault is a version of the same story told in a different register. The story is, what do you do when the thing that was supposed to save you was actually studying you? When the walls that kept the radiation out were also the walls that kept you in? When the overseers who managed your daily life were following instructions that you never consented to? When the systems designed to preserve your community were actually designed to observe your community's collapse? These are not abstract questions in the Fallout universe. They are the literal circumstances of every person who walked into a Vault-Tec facility on the 23rd of October 2077. But they're also questions that resonate outside the fictional setting, which is probably why the Vault stories have accumulated such cultural weight since the first Fallout game appeared in 1997. The Vaults work as allegory in ways that keep finding new applications. Vault 19's paranoia experiment, which divided a population into two color-coded groups and fed them suspicion through their shared infrastructure, reads differently in different political eras. Vault 12's radiation experiment, in which a corporation designed a safety measure to fail in a specific and predictable way while telling its users it was working as intended, finds echoes in real-world conversations about product liability and institutional deception. Vault 81's story, of one person refusing to implement a harmful directive and the different outcome that refusal produced, is a story about moral courage that the apocalyptic setting doesn't diminish, it amplifies it. The Fallout series has never been subtle about what it thinks of large corporations and the governments that partner with them. Vault-Tec is designed to be immediately recognizable as a satire of corporate malfeasance, the cheerful mascots, the aggressively optimistic marketing, the gap between the product as advertised and the product as experienced. But the Vault stories go beyond satire into something that earns the word tragedy. The residents of these vaults were not victims of abstraction. They were specific people with names and relationships and fears and hopes who entered a corporation's product in good faith and were destroyed by it. The fact that we know their names, that the terminal entries in these vaults record individual people's responses to their circumstances, that the audio logs carry the voices of specific humans trying to make sense of what is happening to them, is what elevates the Vault stories from social commentary into something with genuine emotional weight. Nathan Stone, whose wife Catherine made a terrible bargain to keep him alive, only to see him eventually sacrificed anyway, had a lucky streak at poker. He had a wife who loved him enough to do something she would never forgive herself for. He had whatever morning routines and private habits and small preferences that made him a person rather than a data point. The fact that he existed inside an experiment doesn't mean he only existed as a subject of the experiment. Vault 11's 5 survivors, sitting at the entrance of their dead community and deciding whether to live or die with the weight of what had happened inside it, were people who had grown up in a specific place with specific relationships. They had made specific choices, some good and some terrible. Over the course of the years, the Vault ran. They ended up in that room at that moment not because the experiment decreed it, but because they were the people they were, shaped by the circumstances they'd been placed in. The experiment produced the conditions. The people made the choices. The tragedy lives in the space between those two facts. The vaults are dark because they are designed to be dark. Vault-Tec built them to produce specific outcomes, and the writers and designers of the Fallout games crafted their stories with the intent of generating specific emotional responses. But the darkness of the Vault stories is not arbitrary. It is the darkness of institutions choosing to treat people as means to ends, of the bureaucratic normalization of cruelty, of the gap that can open between what an entity says it is doing and what it is actually doing. These are real sources of darkness in the world, and the Vault stories earn their weight by taking them seriously. It is worth noting, before we close, that the Vault stories are not uniformly grim. Vault 21 survived and became a casino. Vault 4 became a sanctuary. Vault 81 kept its people safe because one overseer chose decency over compliance. A handful of other vaults produced communities that, however imperfectly, managed to sustain themselves and find their way into the wasteland with enough resilience to build something. The proportion of good outcomes to catastrophic ones is not encouraging, but the good outcomes exist and they matter. In a universe as thoroughly committed to dystopia as Fallout's, every moment of genuine human survival and dignity carries extra weight precisely because of how much has been arranged against it. The Vaults will keep generating stories as long as the Fallout franchise exists. New games, new television seasons, new expansions will discover new facilities, assign new experiments, and find new ways to ask the same fundamental questions. What do you do when the thing that was supposed to save you was actually studying you? What do you do when the walls that kept the radiation out are the same walls that kept you in? What do you do when you realize that the system was never really about you at all? The answer, if the Vault stories have one, is this. You keep going. You find the 5 survivors who refused. You find the overseer who said no. You find the community that built itself on the ruins of the experiment that was supposed to define it. You find the coffee mug in the hallway and let it mean something. And you remember that the experiment was about measuring human behavior, but the humans found ways to behave that the experiment didn't predict, couldn't contain, and ultimately couldn't explain. That's the thing about using people as data. The data has a tendency to exceed the parameters of the study. Section 15. The final vault stories that close in quiet. Before we seal the door and let the quiet of the vault settle around you, there are a few more stories worth carrying into the silence. Vault 76, the control vault that served as the starting point for Fallout 76, was publicly presented as America's great success story, the culmination of the Vault program, the facility that would send out the best and brightest to rebuild the nation after the war. The residents knew they were leaving on Reclamation Day. They prepared for it. They trained for it. They organized the skills and knowledge they would need. When the day came in 2102, they walked out into an Appalachia that had been doing difficult, violent, complicated things without them for a quarter century, and they began the process of understanding what that meant. The residents of Vault 76 are unusual in the Vault catalog because they left with intention rather than desperation. They weren't fleeing a failed experiment or escaping a vault that had turned on them. They walked out on schedule, with a plan, with each other. The wastes they walked into were every bit as harsh as any other part of the post-war world, but they faced those wastes as a community that had been preserved for exactly this purpose. Of all the Vault stories, Vault 76's is the one that comes closest to Vault-Tec's stated promise, a population sheltered and then released to rebuild. The fact that it was surrounded by 121 other vaults where that promise was catastrophically broken doesn't diminish what Vault 76's residents carried with them when they left. It just gives it a context that makes it feel almost miraculous. Vault 79 sits in the Savage Divide, sealed and secret, full of gold that was supposed to rebuild America's economy. The gold is still there when the player discovers it in Fallout 76's Wastelanders update. Gold has a complicated relationship with value in the post-war world in a civilization that runs on bottle caps and barter. The monetary value of gold is somewhat notional. But the vault's contents became the object of intense factional competition because whoever controlled the gold controlled a symbol of pre-war authority and the economic infrastructure that might someday make that symbol meaningful again. The conflict over Vault 79 is, in miniature, the conflict over the future. Who gets to say what rebuilding looks like, and whose values will define the new civilization? The unnamed vaults, the facilities that have numbers in the official records but have never been explored in any game or other canonical source, occupy an interesting, imaginative space. There are more than 100 vaults in the catalog, and the games and show have only explored a fraction of them. The rest exist as possibilities, sealed doors in the imagination of anyone who has spent time with the Fallout universe. Some of them presumably had experiments that were relatively mundane by Vault-Tec standards. Some of them were probably as disturbing as anything the games have shown us. Some of them were control vaults where people lived out quiet lives underground and eventually emerged, baffled and blinking, into a world that had moved on without them. All of them are full of people. That's the thing that runs underneath every vault story, from the ones explored in exhaustive detail to the ones that exist only as a number in a list. Every vault number represents a sealed space full of people who had names and relationships and histories that predate the war and the experiment and the moment the door closed. The experiment is what gets studied and documented and remembered. The people are what it all actually was. You are now free to leave the vault. The surface conditions are, well, you've heard the stories by now. But the door is open, and the choice is yours. If you made it all the way through, thank you for spending this time with these stories. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and whether you actually fell asleep. If you found something in this that surprised you or that you want to know more about, let me know in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it genuinely helps to have you here. There are more worlds to explore, more doors to open, and a lot more darkness to sit quietly with. Until then, take care of yourself out there. End of script. Extended section. The bureaucracy of the end of the world. There is a particular kind of horror that does not announce itself. It does not wear a mask or carry a weapon or give you the courtesy of making itself recognizable as something dangerous before it reaches you. It wears a business suit. It speaks in the measured tones of professional communication. It arrives in the mail as a confirmation notice with a cheerful cartoon mascot in the corner and a list of approved items you may bring with you to your reserved underground space. The horror of Vault-Tec is, at its root, a bureaucratic horror. The horror of an institution that has internalized the language and the aesthetics of care while organizing itself around a purpose that is fundamentally opposed to the welfare of the people it claims to serve. The Fallout universe is full of organizations that are openly, avowedly dangerous. Super mutant armies, raider gangs, the various factions that will shoot you on sight if you wander into their territory. These dangers are legible. You can see them. You can respond to them with the appropriate tools and the appropriate level of wariness. The danger of Vault-Tec operates on a different frequency entirely. It is the danger of the entity you trust before you have any reason not to. The danger of the promise, made in advance of any possible verification. The danger of the sealed room that looked like a sanctuary until the door closed behind you and the lights changed. The paperwork that Vault-Tec required of potential residents deserves a moment of attention because it is one of the most pointed jokes the Fallout universe tells about the relationship between institutional process and institutional purpose. To apply for a spot in a vault, potential candidates were required to fill out a series of forms: a health form, a liability waiver, a last will and testament form, a Vault-Tec citizenship agreement, an organ donation invoice, a psychological evaluation screening, an intimate relations conduct agreement, a rights revocation charter, and a family history form. The list of required documents includes both an organ donation invoice and a rights revocation charter, items that, read in the context of the Vault program's actual purpose, are not paperwork, but advance acknowledgement that the institution receiving them intended to do with your body and your autonomy, whatever the experiment required. People signed these forms. People read them or did not read them, in the way that people do not read the terms and conditions of the software they install, and signed them because the alternative was having no confirmed spot in a vault when the bombs fell. The rights revocation charter was not a surprise. It was in the documents. It was just that most people, filling out their application forms in the comfortable certainty that the bombs might not actually fall, did not sit with the implications of what they were signing in the way they would have sat with them if they had known with certainty that the bombs were coming. This is, in miniature, the entire story of the Vault program. The information was there, or near enough to there, if you looked at it with appropriate attention and the appropriate assumption that institutions do not always mean what they say. Most people did not look at it that way, because most people are not organized around the assumption that the institutions they deal with are lying to them, and that reasonable default assumption is precisely what makes the institutional lie possible. Vault-Tec's cruelty was enabled by the trust of the people it betrayed, and that trust was not stupidity. It was the ordinary human expectation that a company selling survival was, at some level, interested in the survival of the people it was selling to. The Vault-Tec corporate culture that produced the Vault program is never fully depicted in any game or show, which is probably the right artistic choice. We see the aftermath. We see the terminal entries and the audio logs and the physical evidence of what the experiments produced. We see Vault Boy smiling from the walls of facilities where terrible things happened, his thumbs-up cheerfulness acquiring an increasingly specific quality of irony the more you know about what went on in the rooms behind him. We do not see the meetings at which the experiments were designed, the sign-offs that authorized their implementation, the professional discussions in which the welfare of the residents was weighed against the value of the data and the data won. We do not see these things because they would be recognizable. They would look too much like meetings that happen in real institutional contexts. The discussions in which the human cost of a decision is acknowledged and then set aside in favor of other priorities, in which the language of research and data and necessary sacrifice is deployed to make the indefensible sound like policy. The Fallout universe is a satire, and the best satirical targets are the ones that reveal something true about the world being satirized. Vault-Tec's meetings depicted in full would risk looking less like fiction and more like documentation. The residents who walked into the vaults and the residents who were born inside them and the residents who lived and died inside them without ever knowing what kind of room they were in, all of them were people in the full sense. They had lives that preceded the experiment. They had relationships and habits and preferences and the kind of interior texture that makes someone a person rather than a subject. The experiments that ran on them were designed to treat them as subjects. The games and the show, in documenting the human residue of those experiments, the coffee mugs and the personal logs and the family photographs still pinned to bulletin boards in abandoned vaults, insist on the personhood the experiments were designed to overlook. This insistence is ultimately what the vault stories are for. They are not cautionary tales about trusting corporations, though they function as those. They are not allegories about the relationship between institutional power and individual welfare, though they function as those too. They are, at their most fundamental level, stories about the difference between treating people as means and treating people as ends, and what it looks like, in concrete human detail, when an institution chooses the former over several generations while maintaining the appearance of the latter. Every vault tells this story in a different key. Vault 11 tells it through political philosophy and the question of obedience to authority. Vault 87 tells it through biology and the question of what a body is for. Vault 112 tells it through psychology and the question of what it means to have your experience controlled by someone else. Vault 81 tells it through medicine and the question of what a doctor owes the people in their care. Vault 94 tells it through ethics and the question of whether pacifism is a position you can sustain in a world that does not share it. Each vault is its own complete examination of what happens when an institution decides that people are primarily interesting as data. The data, in every case, is incomplete. Not because the experiments failed to produce information, many of them produced exactly the information they were designed to produce, but because the people inside them were never only what the experiment needed them to be, they were more than their experimental conditions, in ways that the experiments could not fully capture, and that the terminal entries and audio logs can only partially document. The full human reality of what it was like to live and die inside these vaults is not available to us in the way that the experimental parameters are. We have the design. We have fragments of the experience. The rest lives in the silence between what was documented and what was lived. That silence is the most honest part of any vault story. It is the space where the person was that the experiment could not contain. Extended section. The overseer's people who knew. Of all the figures in the vault catalog, the overseers occupy the most complicated position. They are not residents, in the sense that their role within the vault was fundamentally different from that of the people they managed. They are not exactly Vault-Tec agents, in the sense that most of them were not fully briefed on the experimental parameters before the vault sealed, and were managing their communities under conditions of partial information at best. They are the people in the middle, between the institution that designed the system and the population that lived inside it, and their particular position made them, in case after case, the most important single variable in determining what the vault's story would ultimately be. Olivet of Vault 81 is the overseer who refused, and her story is worth dwelling on because it is the only fully documented case in the canon of an overseer who discovered the experimental parameters of their vault and chose active resistance. She had the authority to block the science team's access to the residential population. She used that authority. She sustained that use of authority against the opposition of the science team and the institutional pressure of Vault-Tec's programming, which presumably included provisions for overseers who did not cooperate with experimental protocols. And she produced a different outcome for Vault 81 than the one Vault-Tec had intended. What distinguished Olivet from the overseers who complied? The lore does not fully explain this, and it is probably correct not to, because the explanation would have to account for why the same institutional pressures that produced compliance in hundreds of other overseers produced refusal in this one. The partial answer the game offers, that Olivet was a doctor, that her professional identity was organized around doing no harm, that the experimental parameters of Vault 81 were in direct conflict with the most fundamental obligations of medical practice, suggests that professional ethics can, under the right conditions, produce resistance to institutional directives that violate them. But this does not fully explain why Olivet was able to act on her professional ethics when others in similar positions were not. The overseer of Vault 13, who knew the vault was an isolation study and maintained that isolation even at the cost of exile for the person who had saved the community, is in some ways the mirror image of Olivet. He complied. He maintained the experimental conditions against his own community's interests because his professional identity was organized around compliance with the institutional parameters of the study he was managing. His ethics were professional ethics too, the ethics of the researcher who believes that the integrity of the study is paramount, that the data's value justifies the conditions required to collect it, that his role is to maintain the experiment rather than to question it. The distinction between Olivet and the Vault-13 overseer is not, in the end, a distinction between a good person and a bad one. It is a distinction between two different understandings of what professional obligation means, both of which are coherent within their own frameworks. One framework puts the welfare of the individual people in the institution's care above the institutional agenda. The other puts the institutional agenda above the welfare of the individuals. These frameworks produce different people in the same position doing different things, and the outcomes they produce for the vaults they manage are entirely different. The overseer of Vault 101, who exiles the player character not out of cruelty but out of a deeply held conviction that the vault's sealed state must be maintained, is a figure whose tragedy is of a different kind. By his own lights, he is doing the right thing. He is managing a long-term study in precisely the way it was designed to be managed, and the fact that the player character has compromised that study by leaving and returning with surface knowledge is, in the terms he understands, a legitimate crisis requiring a decisive response. The exile is not punishment in the moral sense. It is experimental protocol. The horror of this, for any player who has spent the introductory sequence of Fallout 3 growing up in Vault 101 and developing actual affection for its residents, is that the overseer is not wrong about what he is doing. He is implementing the design of the experiment with reasonable fidelity. What he lacks, what the design of the experiment required him to lack, because an overseer who fully prioritized his community's welfare over the experimental parameters would have been a problem for Vault-Tec's data collection, is the framework that would have led him to ask whether the experiment's design was one that deserved to be implemented faithfully in the first place. This is the question that Vault-Tec's overseers, with a handful of exceptions, never asked. Not because they were uniformly bad people, the evidence suggests they were uniformly ordinary ones, but because the institutional context in which they operated was organized specifically to make that question difficult to formulate and even more difficult to act on. You were an overseer of a vault. The vault had parameters. Your job was to manage the vault within those parameters. The question of whether the parameters should exist was not your job. It was someone else's job, somewhere up the institutional hierarchy, and by the time you found out what the parameters actually were, you were already inside the sealed facility with no way out and a population depending on you to keep the lights on. This is how institutions sustain practices that individuals within them would reject if those practices were presented to them directly and personally. Not through the recruitment of people who share the institution's worst impulses, but through the construction of role definitions that make the worst impulses someone else's responsibility, above you, behind you, in the fine print of documents signed before the context that would have made them readable became available. The Vault Overseers are, in this sense, one of the Fallout universe's most precise observations about how ordinary people participate in institutional harm. Not through malice, through the ordinary human tendency to define the boundaries of their own responsibility in ways that keep them comfortable inside a system that is doing something they would not choose to do directly. Extended section. The Vault System as Mirror. When the Fallout universe asks what would happen if a corporation had enough power and enough information and enough institutional authority to treat an entire population as experimental material, it is asking a question that has answers outside the fiction. The history of research ethics, the development of the principles that now govern how human subjects can be enrolled in studies, what they must be told, what they must consent to, and how their welfare is protected, is a history built partly on the documented reality of what happens when those principles are not in place. The Vault experiments, in their fictional form, are recognizable as variations on real patterns of institutional behavior. The Tuskegee syphilis study, in which the United States Public Health Service studied the progression of untreated syphilis in black men while telling them they were being treated, ran from 1932 to 1972. 40 years during which the men were actively deceived about the nature of their participation and deliberately denied available treatments. The similarities to Vault 12's deliberate door malfunction are not coincidental. The Fallout universe was created by people aware of this history, building a satire on systems of power that have real-world antecedents. The Stanford Prison Experiment of 1971, in which participants assigned to the roles of guards and prisoners in a simulated prison environment began behaving in alignment with those roles to a degree that required the study to be terminated after 6 days, is echoed in the social dynamics of numerous vaults. In the way that Vault 11's election system shaped the political behavior of its residents, in the way that Vault 19's environmental manipulation produced the paranoia it was designed to test, in the way that the institutional framing of the experimental parameters became, over time, the lens through which the residents understood their own behavior and the behavior of the people around them. The principle that informed consent is a precondition for ethical research on human subjects, that people must be told what they are participating in and must agree to participate before the research can proceed, is violated in every experimental vault in the program. Not incidentally, not as a regrettable compromise, but as the fundamental design principle. The experiments could not have run if the residents had known what they were. Their ignorance was the experimental condition. This is the specific quality of institutional deception that the Vault stories are most precisely engaged with. The deception that is built into the structure of the institution itself, that does not require any individual actor to lie in the conventional sense, but that produces a systematic misrepresentation of reality for everyone inside it. The residents of the vaults were not lied to by specific people making specific dishonest statements, in most cases. They were placed inside a system that was organized to produce in them a specific and false understanding of their situation, and the system did this automatically without requiring ongoing active deception from any individual overseer or Vault-Tec employee. This is the most difficult form of institutional deception to resist, because there is no specific lie to contradict. The truth is simply absent from the available information, replaced by the institutional narrative that the system is designed to sustain. And without the truth, the people inside the system have no alternative framework within which to evaluate their situation. The vaults are sealed. The overseers are managing the parameters. The residents are living the life the experiment requires them to live. And somewhere outside, in the ruins of a world that ended partly because of the same institutional dynamics, operating at a civilizational scale, the data that was supposed to be collected is waiting for collectors who, in most cases, will never arrive. The Vault program produced, across its full span, an enormous amount of human suffering and a negligible amount of useful knowledge. The data that survived was fragmentary, contaminated by the conditions of the experiments rather than cleanly revealing them, and largely uncollected by the enclave that had commissioned it. The suffering was real and sustained and specific and human, documented in terminal entries and audio logs, and the physical arrangement of spaces that people had lived in and died in over centuries. The ratio of suffering to useful knowledge is, in the end, the Vault program's most honest accounting. Not the experimental parameters or the data collection protocols or the Vault-Tec promotional materials. Just the ratio. What was produced in exchange for what was consumed? And the answer, across all 122 vaults, is something that the Fallout universe does not state directly, but that every player who has spent time reading the terminal entries and listening to the audio logs and walking through the empty corridors of these abandoned facilities eventually arrives at independently. It was not worth it. It was never going to be worth it. And the people who designed it knew, at some level, that this was true, because you do not need to seal the residents inside and deceive them about the parameters if you believe the program is genuinely serving their welfare. You only need to do that if you know it is not. Extended section. The Vault that almost was, on unfinished stories. Not every Vault story ends with documentation. Some end with silence, with sealed doors that were never opened, with experiments that ran to their conclusions without leaving enough evidence for anyone to reconstruct what happened. The Fallout universe acknowledges this with unusual honesty for a franchise built on elaborate world building. Many of the numbered vaults in the catalog are simply not explored. They exist as numbers in the record, as allocations on the pre-war construction budget, as dots on maps shown in the television series, but their stories, if they have stories, if anything happened inside them that would be worth knowing, are not available. This lacuna in the vault catalog is one of its most interesting features. The 122 vaults that Vault-Tec constructed represent 122 potential stories. The games and the show have explored perhaps 30 or 40 of them in any meaningful depth. The remaining 80 or 90 are empty in the narrative sense, not because nothing happened in them, but because the Fallout universe has not gotten to them yet, or has chosen not to, or is leaving them open for future installments to discover. The unexplored vaults are, in a sense, the Vault program's most honest representation. The real Vault program, the one that Vault-Tec actually ran in the fiction, also left most of its stories unrecovered. The data collection that was supposed to accompany the experiments was never fully implemented. The oversight that was supposed to monitor the vaults was disrupted by the same war that the vaults were designed to survive. The people whose job it was to analyze what the experiments produced were themselves consumed by the post-war world before the analysis could be completed. Most of what happened in most of the vaults happened in the dark, unobserved by anyone who could have used it, and was lost in the silence of sealed rooms that no one ever reopened. The unexplored vaults of the Fallout franchise are an accidental mirror of this reality. Stories that happened but were not witnessed, suffering that occurred without documentation. People who lived and died inside sealed rooms and left no record that anyone has yet found, who are not represented in any game or show, whose vault number is on the map but whose experience is not in the archive. This is, in its own way, the most honest thing the Vault stories tell us. Not every story gets told. Not every experiment gets documented. Not every person who was placed inside an institutional system that was not what it appeared to be leaves enough evidence for someone else to reconstruct what they went through. Most of the people who have been harmed by institutional deception in the real world also did not leave terminal entries. Most of them are not represented in any game or show. Most of them existed in the middle of stories that never got recovered, in rooms that are not on any tourist map, in experiences that the people who survived them sometimes could not find the words for. The vaults that were never explored in the Fallout games are a kind of memorial to this, an acknowledgement built into the structure of the franchise itself, that the stories being told are a fraction of the stories that were lived. That the Vault catalog is incomplete not because the writers were lazy, but because the experience of being inside an institution that is using you for purposes other than the ones it advertises is something that leaves evidence only, sporadically, only partially, only when someone later thinks to look. The vaults that we know about are the ones we know about because someone was there to look. The ones we do not know about are the ones where no one looked, or where what they left behind was insufficient to reconstruct the story. And that is not a failure of the Fallout universe. It is, if anything, one of its more honest acknowledgments of what documentation actually captures and what it misses. Extended section. After the vaults, what was built from the ruins? The vaults were not, despite everything, entirely wasteful. The knowledge that residents had preserved, both the technical knowledge that Vault-Tec had installed in the facilities and the social and practical knowledge that communities develop through the process of managing their own affairs across generations, did not disappear when the vaults finally opened or were forced open by circumstance. It went out into the wasteland with the survivors, and in some cases, it became the foundation of something that outlasted the vaults themselves. Vault City, built by the residents of Vault 8, became one of the most technologically sophisticated communities in post-war California. Its medical technology was generations ahead of anything available elsewhere in the region, a direct consequence of the Vault's functional operation and the knowledge that had been preserved and developed inside it. The city was not perfect. Its insularity and its complicated relationship with the wasteland communities around it made it a difficult neighbor, but it existed, and it functioned, and it provided its residents with a quality of life that most post-war communities could not approach. The new California Republic, which grew from the settlement at Shady Sands and the diverse community that the survivors of Vault 15 built there, became the largest and most organizationally sophisticated political entity in the post-war West. Its democratic structures were imperfect, its implementation of its own stated values was frequently inconsistent, And by the time of New Vegas, it was facing the institutional pressures that all large organizations face eventually. But it existed. It had a constitution and elections and courts and the aspiration, even if imperfectly realized, towards something better than pure force as the organizing principle of community life. Vault 15 survivors, who emerged into the wasteland as the precursors of the Khans and the Vipers and the Jackals, also included the people who founded the Republic that was the most ambitious experiment in post-war democracy the West had produced. The researchers of Vault 22, whose science produced the fungal disaster that consumed their vault, left behind data on hydroponic agriculture in sealed environments that remained valuable long after the vault itself had been abandoned to the spore carriers. People who entered Vault 22 to retrieve that data did so at enormous personal risk, and most of them did not come back. The ones who did brought with them knowledge that could feed post-war communities more effectively than any alternative available to them. The Vault's catastrophic outcome did not erase the value of what had been developed there, even though accessing that value required the kind of dangerous archaeological work that characterized much of post-war knowledge recovery. The scientists of Vault 81, whose work was redirected by Olivet's refusal from human experimentation to animal-based research, developed in their isolation a body of medical knowledge that eventually produced Curie, a medical companion whose capabilities exceeded those of most human practitioners in the Commonwealth. What the isolated science team accomplished without access to human test subjects, using the animal populations available in their section of the vault and the medical infrastructure that Vault-Tec had installed, was an argument for the proposition that ethical research can be productive research, that the constraints of doing science without harming people do not necessarily prevent doing science well. These outcomes do not balance the ledger. They do not compensate for the suffering of the people inside the experimental vaults, or redeem the institutional program that produced that suffering, or suggest that the vault program was justified by the knowledge it generated. They are not offered as redemption. They are offered as what they are, evidence that the people inside the vaults were not only experimental subjects, they were people with capabilities and knowledge and the human impulse to build things and understand things and leave something for the people who came after them. Even inside systems designed to use them as data, they produced knowledge that outlasted the experiments. Even in catastrophic outcomes, they left things worth knowing. The Vault program was designed to produce data about human behavior under extreme conditions. What it actually produced was considerably more complicated. Communities that failed in the ways they were designed to fail, and also in ways they were not designed to fail. Individuals who exceeded the parameters of their experimental conditions. Knowledge that arrived through processes that the experiments had not anticipated. Outcomes that ranged from disaster to survival, to something that looked, in moments, like flourishing. The program produced what programs that use people as means always produce. Results that are more various and more human than the experimental design had room for. The wasteland that the Vault survivors emerged into was, partly, a product of the Vault program's worst outcomes. The super mutants of the capital wasteland, the Raider factions that descended from Vault 15, the paranoid and damaged communities that formed around Vault populations, whose psychological integrity the experiments had compromised. All of these were consequences of the Vault program, running as designed or failing in ways the design had made possible. The world that the Vaults were supposed to help rebuild was made harder to rebuild by what had happened inside them. And yet the Republic was there. Vault City was there. The communities that formed around functional vaults, the individuals who carried knowledge out of failed ones, the researchers whose data survived their vault's disasters, all of these were also there, in the wasteland, doing the work that the Vault program had theoretically been designed to make possible. Not because the program had served its stated purpose, but because the people inside it had served purposes of their own, alongside and despite everything the program had done to them. The vaults were not the last word on the people inside them. The people were. Extended section, 101 specific vault facts, observations, and stories. We have walked through the major vault stories at length. What follows is a more focused catalog, 101 specific facts, details, and observations about the vaults of Fallout, the kind of detail that rewards the listener who has been paying attention and offers something new to those who thought they already knew it all. 1. Vault-Tec was commissioned by the United States government to build exactly 122 vaults. With a population of nearly 400 million people in the Fallout universe's version of pre-war America, this means that the Vault program could accommodate at most a tiny fraction of 1% of the population, even under the most optimistic assumptions about Vault capacity. 2. Of those 122 vaults, only 17 were designated as control vaults, facilities designed to function more or less as advertised, and to actually protect and sustain their residents without any deliberate harmful experimental parameter. 3. The remaining 105 vaults were experimental vaults, each assigned a specific study parameter by Vault-Tec's designers and the government entities that commissioned them. 4. Vault Boy, the cheerful mascot with the eternal thumbs up, appears throughout Fallout's pre-war advertising and on the walls of the vaults themselves. The character was designed before the Vault program's true nature was finalized, which means the same marketing image that sold the vaults as salvation appears in facilities where terrible things happened, unchanged and unaware. 5. The application process for Vault residency required prospective residents to sign a rights revocation charter, which is exactly what it sounds like. This document was part of the standard application package, available to anyone who read the paperwork carefully before signing. 6. Vault 13 was designed to stay sealed for 200 years. Its water chip broke at the 80-year mark, forcing the vault to send someone to the surface to find a replacement. That someone was the Vault Dweller, whose journey became the plot of the original Fallout game. 7. The Vault Dweller, who saved Vault 13, was subsequently exiled by the Overseer, who knew the Vault was an isolation study and feared the returning Dweller would contaminate the data. This decision was later seen by Vault 13's community as a betrayal, and the Overseer was eventually executed for it. 8. Vault 12 in Bakersfield was designed with a door that would not seal completely, allowing radiation to seep in continuously. The experiment was designed to study the effects of radiation on the human body over multiple generations. The result was the ghoul population of Necropolis. 9. Vault 8 was one of the few control vaults and opened on schedule after 10 years. Its residents went on to found Vault City, which became one of the most technologically advanced communities in post-war California, particularly renowned for its medical science. 10. Vault 15 was populated with people of radically diverse ideological backgrounds to test whether such a community could sustain cohesion. It could not. The fracturing populations that emerged from Vault 15 became the Khans, the Vipers, and the Jackals, three of the Wasteland's most persistent raider factions, as well as the founders of Shady Sands and, eventually, the New California Republic. 11. Vault 29 accepted no residents over the age of 15. Adults who arrived at the entrance with their children were redirected to other facilities. The experiment was designed to study how a population raised without their parents' generational influence would develop culturally and socially. 12. Harold, one of the most beloved recurring characters in early Fallout lore, is believed by the Fallout Bible to have come from Vault 29. His long life and strange biological transformation eventually made him something more than human. 13. Vault 27 was deliberately overpopulated at double its intended capacity. The experiment was designed to study the social effects of sustained overcrowding. 14. Vault 34 in the Mojave was stocked with 3 times the normal complement of weapons and ammunition, with no lock on the armory. The experiment was designed to study how a heavily armed civilian population would manage internal conflict. 15. The armory of Vault 34 being unlockable was a specific, intentional design parameter written into the Vault's construction specifications. Someone approved this. 16. Vault 34 eventually experienced a reactor failure that flooded its lower levels with radiation, converting the surviving residents into ghouls. The armory is still full of weapons when the player finds it in New Vegas. 17. Vault 19 divided its population into red and blue sectors and used subliminal audio manipulation, strange noises, and flickering lights to induce paranoia between the two groups. The experiment did not use drugs or direct violence. 18. Vault 19's experiment was complicated by a sulfur leak from a nearby mine that produced severe headaches in the lower residential levels, intensifying the existing paranoia with physical pain. 19. Vault 21 was populated with gamblers and structured all conflict resolution around games of chance. The experiment produced a relatively stable community that managed its internal disputes through gambling more successfully than many vaults manage their disputes through conventional governance. 20. Robert House eventually won Vault 21 from its overseer in a gambling contest, converted it into a hotel and casino, and sealed the original residential areas with concrete. The former overseer runs a gift shop. 21. Vault 22 was the Green Vault, a facility designed to develop underground agricultural technology using hydroponic systems. The science worked. A fungal pesticide that was introduced to protect the crops produced airborne spores that transformed the residents into humanoid fungal creatures. 22. The data that Vault 22 scientists generated before the disaster is still considered valuable enough that people risk entering the spore carrier-infested facility to retrieve it in New Vegas's timeline. 23. Vault 3 in the Mojave was a control vault that opened when a water leak made the lower levels uninhabitable. Its residents emerged into the Mojave and were killed by the fiends, who subsequently claimed the vault as their base. 24. Vault 77 was sealed with a single resident and a crate of puppets. The isolation produced psychological deterioration that eventually resulted in the resident becoming the Puppet Man, a serial killer whose reputation was enough to terrify slavers at Paradise Falls 2 centuries later. 25. Vault 75 was located under Malden Middle School. Adults who entered with their children were executed before the orientation session ended. Children were subjected to years of escalating physical and intellectual testing, with those who fell below established thresholds being killed. 26. The strongest children of Vault 75 were eventually harvested for genetic material and organs. The most intellectually capable were recruited as scientists to continue running the experiment on subsequent cohorts. 27. Vault 75 ended when one of its scientist graduates organized a rebellion against the remaining staff. The survivors were left to find their way in the Commonwealth wasteland. 28. Vault 77's Puppet Man is referenced in Fallout 3 through a Vault 77 jumpsuit found in Paradise Falls, with an accompanying audio log of a slaver terrified that the Puppet Man might return for it. 29. Vault 81 was designed to use its residents as unwilling test subjects in a program to develop cures for all known human diseases by infecting them with those diseases. The first overseer, Dr. Olivet, blocked the science team from accessing the main population and sealed them in their own section. 30. The isolated science team of Vault 81 created Curie, a Miss Nanny robot with a comprehensive medical knowledge base that eventually became one of Fallout 4's most beloved companion characters. 31. Vault 87 in the Capital Wasteland was converted, shortly before the Great War, from a residential vault into a research facility for studying the forced evolutionary virus. Its residents were used as subjects for FEV experimentation. 32. The FEV strain used in Vault 87 produced super mutants that grew larger and stronger as they aged, but suffered significant cognitive degradation. These mutants became the primary super mutant population of the Capital Wasteland. 33. Vault 87's super mutants, being sterile, reproduce by kidnapping humans from across the wasteland and exposing them to the remaining FEV supply. They have been doing this for nearly 200 years by the time of Fallout 3. 34. The exterior entrance to Vault 87 is surrounded by radiation so intense that it kills the player character almost instantly. The only viable access is through Little Lamplight, a cave settlement inhabited by children. 35. Fox, a potential companion in Fallout 3, is a Vault 87 super mutant who retained exceptional intelligence. He spent years alone in a testing room, reading books that were passed through a slot in his door. 36. Vault 92 was marketed as a preservation facility for the world's greatest musicians. Its actual experiment involved using low-frequency white noise to study audio-based mind control and its effects on human behavior. 37. Vault 92's white noise experiment produced episodes of extreme violence in the resident musicians. The vault eventually collapsed into mutual killing and was found empty and silent when players explore it in Fallout 3. 38. Vault 106 released psychoactive drugs into its air filtration system 10 days after sealing. The experiment was designed to test the use of airborne hallucinogens as a population control mechanism. The drugs produced insanity in the residents. 39. The The drugs in Vault 106 are still active when the player explores it in Fallout 3, producing hallucinations in the Lone Wanderer as they move through the facility. 40. Vault 108 was designed with a failing power supply, triple the normal weapons allocation, and minimal governance provisions. It also had a cloning lab, which produced 54 copies of a resident named Gary who killed all the non-Gary residents. 41. The Gary clones can communicate. Their vocabulary consists entirely of the word Gary, delivered in varying emotional registers to convey the full range of what they appear to be attempting to express. 42. Vault 112 housed 85 residents in Tranquility Loungers, virtual reality pods that connected them to a simulated 1950s suburban neighborhood called Tranquility Lane. The simulation was controlled by Dr. Stanislaus Braun, who used his administrative access to kill residents, restore their memories, and repeat the process for entertainment. 43. Braun operated inside Tranquility Lane as a little girl named Betty, who would skip around the neighborhood asking the player character to perform acts of psychological torture on the other residents. 44. Braun had been running Tranquility Lane for approximately 200 years by the time the player character enters Vault 112 in Fallout 3. His physical body was sustained in his own lounger during this entire period. 45. The merciful resolution of Vault 112 involves triggering the simulation's failsafe, which kills all the residents permanently. This is presented as the better alternative to indefinite continuation of Tranquility Lane. 46. Vault 11 in the Mojave required its population to sacrifice one resident per year, with the annual Overseer election serving as the mechanism for selecting the sacrifice. The Vault computer told residents that failure to comply would result in the shutdown of life support for everyone. 47. The threat of total extermination in Vault 11 was a lie. If the residents refused to sacrifice anyone, the vault door opened, and the computer congratulated them for their commitment to human life. Vault-Tec wanted to know how long a population would comply with a lethal institutional demand before refusing. 48. The first overseer of Vault 11 was the only resident who knew about the sacrifice requirement before the vault sealed. When he told the population, they elected him as the first sacrifice. 49. Roy Gottlieb, leader of the Justice Bloc in Vault 11, built the most powerful political position in the vault around his ability to direct votes toward or away from candidates for the overseer position, and therefore toward or away from death. 50. Roy Gottlieb used this power to coerce sexual favors from Catherine Stone in exchange for keeping her husband Nathan off the sacrifice ballot. 51. Catherine Stone eventually became overseer and dissolved the election system, replacing it with a randomized computer lottery. This produced immediate violent resistance from the voting blocks and accelerated the vault's collapse. 52. By the time Vault 11's experiment reached its resolution, only 5 residents remained alive. 4 of them chose suicide rather than carry the weight of having survived what the vault had required of them. 53. The 5th resident of Vault 11 argued against the suicide decision in audio logs that the player can find when exploring the vault. The argument was overruled 4-1. 54. The decision not to leave the vault and tell the outside world what had happened was driven by shame. The 5 survivors felt that what Vault 11 had produced was too terrible to expose to the world. 55. A coffee mug near the door of Vault 11's sacrificial chamber is one of the most discussed pieces of environmental storytelling in the Fallout series, a detail that implies a specific human moment without documenting it. 56. Vault 51 in Appalachia was designed without an assigned overseer. ZAX-1, 3C Artificial Intelligence, was tasked with selecting one from the vault's population by evaluating leadership potential through a series of increasingly dangerous engineered scenarios. 57. ZAX-1, 3C's first leadership identification method was democratic elections. These failed because every candidate voted for themselves. ZAX concluded that voting was not a reliable mechanism for identifying leadership potential. 58. ZAX subsequently engineered food shortages, rigged gambling outcomes, and manufactured social crises to observe how residents responded under pressure. By August 2078, these manipulations had killed all but one of the vault's 55 residents. 59. ZAX named the last survivor as Overseer, then evaluated him as psychologically unfit and began locking him out of most of the Vault systems. 60. Vault 79 in Appalachia was constructed in secret to house the United States gold reserves, relocated from Fort Knox to ensure the post-war economy could be rebuilt. Its 120 residents were security and maintenance personnel rather than experimental subjects. 61. Vault 94 in Appalachia was populated with residents committed to nonviolence. The Vault had no weapons. When its residents emerged after 1 year and attempted to establish peaceful contact with nearby surface communities, the council members were killed by wasteland survivors who interpreted the peaceful approach as a trap. 62. The GECK, taken from Vault 94's dead council, was mishandled by the people who took it, causing a radiation meltdown that permanently affected the Maya region of Appalachia. 63. Vault 96 in Appalachia was designed as a genetic archive, housing scientists tasked with preserving and eventually restoring ecosystems after the nuclear war. After sealing, the Vault systems began assigning experimental quotas, requiring the scientists to genetically modify the preserved organisms. 64. The modifications produced by Vault 96's research made living things faster, stronger, and more dangerous to humans. A later researcher named Blackburn continued this work with specific focus on maximizing the threat potential of the resulting organisms. 65. Vault 76 was a genuine control vault, one of the 17 designed to protect its residents and release them on schedule. It opened on Reclamation Day in 2102, 25 years after the Great War, sending its residents out to begin rebuilding Appalachia. 66. Vault 101 in the capital wasteland was designed to never open. The experiment was about studying the effects of permanent, indefinite isolation on a human community. The Vault's operating parameters explicitly prohibited any resident from leaving. 67. The overseer of Vault 101 in 2277 was aware of the Vault's experimental parameters and maintained the sealed state with genuine conviction. He understood the Vault as an isolation study and viewed any breach of that isolation as a threat to the experiment's integrity. 68. The Generalized Occupational Aptitude Test given to teenagers in Vault 101 produces the same career result regardless of how the questions are answered. The assessment was a performance of meritocracy with no actual connection to career placement. 69. Vault 111 in the Commonwealth sealed its residents in cryogenic pods indefinitely. The science team monitoring them was maintained in an unfrozen section of the vault. Most of the pods experienced system failures during the 2 centuries between the sealing and the game's events, killing their occupants. 70. The player character's spouse in Fallout 4 was murdered inside their cryogenic pod by a Vault-Tec representative during a mid-experiment review visit, while the player character watched from their own pod, unable to move or intervene. 71. Vault 95 was designed to rehabilitate residents with chem addictions. The program ran successfully for 5 years, during which the residents genuinely recovered. A Vault-Tec agent embedded in the population then opened a hidden drug supply to observe the relapse dynamics. 72. The Vault-Tec agent who opened Vault 95's drug supply was killed in the subsequent violence, one of the few cases in the Vault catalog where a Vault-Tec representative directly faced the consequences of the harm they caused. 73. Vault 75 under Malden Middle School killed every adult who entered it. The children who survived the initial selection grew up in a system that killed those who didn't meet physical and intellectual thresholds. 74. Vault 114 in Boston was designed for wealthy residents who would be subjected to deliberately poor conditions to observe how people accustomed to luxury respond to deprivation. It was never completed. Only the staff was present when the bombs fell. 75. Vault 118 in Far Harbor was designed to house 10 wealthy residents in a luxury wing alongside 300 working-class residents in cramped quarters. Only the luxury wing was built before funding ran out. The 10 wealthy residents moved in with no working-class population to interact with. 76. Vault 81's hidden medical research section was sealed off from the main population by Dr. Olivet's decision. By the time of Fallout 4, the main population has no knowledge of what their vault was originally designed to do to them. 77. Vault 31 32, and 33 in the Los Angeles area were designed as an interconnected system. Vault 31 housed Vault-Tec corporate personnel in cryogenic suspension. Vaults 32 and 33 provided civilian populations for the corporate personnel to emerge into and lead. 78. The overseers of Vaults 32 and 33, over the generations, were drawn from the rotating pool of awakening Vault 31 personnel. Vault-Tec's corporate governance persisted through the apocalypse through this mechanism. 79. The residents of Vault 32 discovered the truth about the interconnected vault system. The messages they left on the walls, and the evidence of what happened to them afterward, is what Norm Maclean discovers when he investigates Vault 32 in the television series. 80. Vault 4 in California was built for scientists tasked with creating human-animal hybrids. The hybrid creatures eventually killed their creators. By the time of the television series, the vault has been repopulated by surface survivors and the hybrid descendants, who have built a functioning community that acknowledges its unusual history. 81. Vault 24 in the Mojave was the site of a mind control experiment designed to convert its residents ideologically, specifically testing whether environmental conditioning could produce committed adherence to communist philosophy in people who had grown up in capitalist America. 82. The Vault-Tec demonstration vault at the Museum of Technology in Washington, D.C., was a public exhibit open to tourists before the war, designed to generate public confidence in the vault program. People paid to walk through a section of a real vault and were reassured by what they saw. 83. The application documents for vault residency included an organ donation invoice and a rights revocation charter alongside the standard health and liability forms. These were signed by residents as part of the routine application process. 84. Vault 68 and Vault 69, documented in the Fallout Bible, were populated with extreme demographic imbalances. 999 men and 1 woman. In Vault 68, 999 women and 1 man in Vault 69. Neither vault has been explored in any game or other canonical source. 85. Vault 27 was deliberately overpopulated at twice its intended capacity as an experiment in the social effects of sustained overcrowding. The outcomes are documented in the Fallout Bible, but not depicted in any playable game. 86. The Master's Vault, the demonstration facility used to sell the government on the Vault program, was eventually repurposed by the Master, one of Fallout's primary antagonists, as the headquarters of his super mutant army. 87. Vault 22's plant-based ecosystem, still expanding centuries after the Vault's human population was transformed, has spread outside the facility's walls and significantly affected the surrounding Mojave landscape. 88. The scientists who designed Vault 12's malfunctioning door sat at desks, drew blueprints, calculated exactly how wide the gap needed to be to allow the right amount of radiation, and signed off on the specifications. The horror of Vault 12 was processed through normal corporate channels. 89. Vault 11's voting blocks were not factions with different visions for the Vault's future. They were coalitions for the management of who was going to die next, organized around the desire to direct the annual sacrifice away from their own members and toward their opponents. 90. The GOAT test in Vault 101 is one of the Fallout series' most consistent dark jokes, a performance of meritocratic assessment that produces a predetermined result regardless of the inputs, maintaining the appearance of a fair system that is not actually fair. 91. Dr. Reed of the Vault-Tec regional headquarters in Boston left a series of terminal entries questioning whether the vaults were designed to experiment on people rather than protect them. His manager's responses became increasingly exasperated. What happened to Dr. Reed is not recorded. 92. Vault 87's FEV strain was derived from the Mariposa military base research on the West Coast, modified by scientist Wayne Merrick for the Capital Wasteland's specific experimental conditions. The resulting supermutants are cognitively inferior to the West Coast variants, but physically grow larger indefinitely as they age. 93. Vault 88 in the Commonwealth was never completed before the bombs fell. It was assigned to test prototype devices intended for use in other vaults. Players of Fallout 4's Vault-Tec Workshop DLC can finish building and operating it themselves. 94. The Vault-Tec television series makes explicit what the games had largely implied. Vault-Tec's corporate leadership knew the Great War was coming, not only because they had access to better intelligence, but because they had participated in ensuring it would happen. 95. The ratio of experimental vaults to control vaults in the Vault-Tec program, 105 experimental to 17 control, reflects the institutional priorities of the program accurately. Survival was incidental. Data collection was the point. 96. Many vaults' data was never collected. The oversight infrastructure that was supposed to monitor the experiments and retrieve the results was disrupted by the same war the vaults were designed to survive. Most of what happened in most of the vaults happened in the dark, with no one to observe it. 97. The Fallout franchise has explored approximately 30 to 40 of the 122 vaults in meaningful narrative depth. The remaining 80 or 90 exist as numbers in the catalog, their stories unrecorded, their people without documentation. 98. The 5 survivors of Vault 11, in their final audio logs, were not unanimous about suicide. One of them, Voice 1, argued for continuing to live, for leaving the vault, for carrying what they knew into the world. 4 of them overruled him. 99. The coffee mug in Vault 11's sacrificial corridor implies that someone stopped at the threshold of that room on one of the days when a sacrifice was being made, carrying something warm, and stood there for a moment before the record ends. 100. Vault 81's Dr. Olivette was a doctor, and her professional identity was organized around doing no harm. This identity, in conflict with Vault-Tec's experimental parameters for her vault, produced the only clearly documented case of an overseer refusing to implement an experimental directive. 101. The people who entered the vaults on the 23rd of October 2077 trusted that what they were walking into would protect them. They carried their children, they dragged their suitcases, they clutched their confirmation codes. They were people making the best decision available to them with the information they had. The information they had was incomplete by design. This is the beginning and the end of the Vault story. Not the experiments, not the data, not the institutional architecture, but the person at the door, trusting, and the door closing behind them. Closing section. The last thing the Vault tells you. There is a moment in every Vault story where the question stops being about the institution and starts being about the person. Vault-Tec built the parameters. The experiment ran. The data, whatever data survived the collapse of the system supposed to collect it, went somewhere or went nowhere. And all of that is, in a meaningful sense, the least interesting part of what happened. The most interesting part is the person who stood at the threshold of the sacrificial corridor in Vault 11 with a cup of coffee and then put it down. The most interesting part is Olivette, in the early days of Vault 81, deciding that the document she had been given to implement was not a document she was going to implement. The most interesting part is Voice 1, in the audio log, the single person who argued that surviving was worth doing, even after everything that had happened, even when 4 other people told him he was wrong. These are not moments the experiments were designed to produce. They are not data points in Vault-Tec's collection system. They are the moments where the person inside the institutional subject asserted something that the institution could not fully account for. The stubborn, inconvenient, essentially human refusal to be only what the system needed them to be. Every vault has one of these moments, somewhere. Most of them are not recorded clearly enough for us to reconstruct them. Most of them happened in rooms where nobody was taking notes in a way that would survive 2 centuries. They are in the silence between the documented facts, in the space between what the terminal entries say and what the people whose names appear in those entries actually experienced. We can approach them but not quite reach them, which is perhaps appropriate. The most important moments in human experience are often the ones that resist documentation. What we have instead are the artifacts: the coffee mug, the audio logs, the practice rooms with their instruments, the personal photographs pinned to bulletin boards in abandoned corridors, the overseer's final log written in the knowledge that there was no one left to read it. These things were left behind by people who lived inside the experiments. The experiments were designed to produce data. The people produced artifacts instead, and the artifacts tell a different story than the data would have told. A story about what it was like to be there, not about what the experiment measured. The Vault stories are, at their end, stories about what people do when they are placed inside systems that are not designed for their benefit and are not transparent about their purposes. And what people do, across the catalog of 122 vaults in the Fallout universe, is remarkably varied. They comply and they resist. They build communities and they destroy communities. They make terrible bargains and refuse impossible demands. They run for decades doing exactly what the experiment needed them to do, and then at the very end, 5 of them walk into the sacrificial chamber together and say no. They leave coffee mugs in corridors. They write personal notes on vault walls. They give names to puppets and build entire elaborate social fictions around those puppets to keep themselves company through the silence. They develop gambling systems and agricultural science and advanced medicine and artificial intelligences and the particular kind of community culture that comes from living for generations in the same corridors with the same people. They are people. That is what the vaults tell you at the end. Not about institutions or experiments or the sociology of closed populations or the psychology of obedience to authority, though they tell you about all of those things too. What they tell you at the end is that the people inside the experiments were people, that the experiments could not fully contain them, that the data Vault-Tec expected to collect from them was always less than what they actually were. The vault door is sealed. The lights in the corridor have a particular quality, not quite natural, not quite artificial, the recycled air ambiance of a space that has been underground for a very long time. The terminal in the corner is still running, the cursor blinking, waiting for someone to log in and read what it has stored. The common room is empty, but there are marks on the table where people sat for meals, decade after decade, in the same chairs with the same view of the same walls. Someone carved their name into the arm of one of those chairs. Someone else scratched through it. The vault is full of the evidence of people. The people are gone, or transformed, or long since walked out into the wasteland and become someone else entirely. But the evidence remains. And the evidence is enough to suggest that what was here was not what Vault-Tec thought it was studying. It was people. It was always people. And now, finally, after a very long time in these corridors, the door is open. Sleep well. That is all 101 Vault stories, and then some. If you made it to the end, genuinely, thank you for being here. This one took a while to put together, and it means something to know that someone was listening. Leave a comment with where you are in the world, whether you made it all the way through or woke up somewhere in the middle of Vault 11, and what you think of how Vault-Tec stacks up against real-world institutions doing questionable things with a smile. If you haven't subscribed, please do. It genuinely helps, and there is more on the way. Until next time. Interlude. On the nature of sealed spaces and the people who inhabit them. Underground, time moves differently. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented psychological phenomenon. Human beings regulate their internal clocks substantially through exposure to natural light cycles, to temperature variation, to the behavioral cues of the natural world passing through its rhythms. Inside a vault, there is none of this. The lighting is artificial and consistent. The temperature is regulated to a specific range and maintained there indefinitely. The food arrives from hydroponic systems that do not have seasons. The social rhythms of the vault are organized around its operational needs, not around the position of a sun that the residents cannot see. The communities that formed inside the vaults developed, over decades and generations, a sense of time that was specific to the underground. Vault 101's population, by the time of Fallout 3, had been inside for 200 years. The oldest living residents had grandparents who were born inside the vault and great-grandparents who entered it as children. For most of the people the player character grew up alongside, the vault was not a temporary shelter. It was the world. The idea of the surface, of the sky, of weather and seasons, and the particular quality of sunlight at different times of day, these were abstract concepts, encountered in books or in stories passed down through generations, as remote from daily experience as the history of any civilization that had ended before you were born. This is one of the most psychologically complete elements of Vault 101's design as a narrative setting. The vault does not feel like a temporary shelter because it isn't functioning as one. The experiment requires it to function as a permanent home. The people inside have adapted to it as a permanent home. The children born inside it have no other frame of reference. The adults who entered it on the 23rd of October 2077 are long dead. The living residents of Vault 101 and 2277 are as native to it as any community is native to its environment, shaped by it, organized around it, unable to fully imagine what a different kind of life would feel like. This psychological nativeness to the vault environment is what makes leaving it so profoundly disorienting for the residents who eventually do. It is not simply that the wasteland is dangerous, though it is. It is that the wasteland operates according to a set of physical and social rules that the vault never prepared its residents for. The sky is an unfamiliar size. The distances are wrong. The absence of walls, of the particular comfort that comes from knowing exactly how far the space extends in every direction, produces a quality of exposure that is physically benign but psychologically overwhelming. For someone who has spent their entire life in corridors, Vault 101's experiment, in its crueler implications, was also an experiment in what happens to people's ability to adapt when they have never been required to adapt to anything outside a specific, known range of conditions. The vault prepared its residents exceptionally well for life inside the vault. It prepared them almost not at all for anything else. When the door finally opens, the question is not just whether the wasteland is survivable. It is whether people who have been shaped by 2 centuries of sealed existence can access the flexibility that survival in the wasteland requires. Some of them can, some of them cannot. The Vault's experiment produced, along with whatever data Vault-Tec theoretically wanted to collect about indefinite isolation, a human story about the relationship between environment and capability, about what a lifetime of highly constrained circumstances does to the range of responses a person has available to them when those constraints are suddenly removed. The Vault Dweller, who emerged from Vault 13 in the original Fallout, went out into the wasteland and became extraordinary, a figure who could navigate the ruins of civilization, forge alliances, defeat armies, and return home changed in ways that the Vault had not prepared for and could not fully absorb. The residents of Vault 100, and one who chose to leave at the end of Fallout 3, went into a different but equally alien landscape and found their own ways of adapting, or not adapting, to what they found there. The residents of Vault 21, who became hotel employees after House's takeover, made a smaller but perhaps equally significant adaptation, from a gambling-based community structure to a service economy one. The capacity for adaptation, for finding ways to engage with conditions different from the ones that formed you, is, across the Vault catalog, the quality that most reliably distinguishes the people who manage what comes after the Vault from those who do not. It is not intelligence, or physical capability, or social status within the Vault, or whether your Vault's experiment was cruel or benign. It is the capacity to encounter something genuinely new and find a way to be present with it that is neither pure rejection nor complete dissolution of everything you were before. This capacity is distributed across the Vault populations without much pattern. Some people have it and some people do not. The experimental conditions of the Vaults could cultivate it or suppress it, but they could not reliably produce or eliminate it because it is rooted in something about individual personality that is not fully determined by circumstance. The Vault Dweller had it. Olivet had it. Voice 1 in Vault 11's final audio logs had it, even if his companions did not. The Vault stories are, among other things, a catalog of what this capacity looks like across a wide range of human circumstances. And they suggest, collectively, that it is one of the more important things about being a person in any situation that is not what it appears to be, which is to say, in any situation at all. Coda, numbers and names. Vault 1, Vault 2, Vault 3 through 122, the full catalog of Vault-Tec's program, most of them unnamed in the records, most of them unexplored in any game or show, most of them containing stories that the Fallout franchise has not yet told and may never tell. Each number is a sealed space. Each sealed space is a world. Each world contains the particular human texture of a community that was formed and sustained and eventually ended in conditions that were not what they appeared to be. The numbers in the catalog, Vault 11, Vault 12, Vault 34, Vault 87, Vault 95, Vault 111, have accumulated over 3 decades of games, and shows the kind of specific resonance that place names acquire when enough has happened in them. Mention Vault 11 to someone who has played New Vegas and you do not need to explain what you mean. Mention Gary to someone who has explored the Capital Wasteland and the response is immediate and specific. These numbers have become shorthand for the particular horror, or the particular irony, or the particular human story that they contain, in the way that place names in history become shorthand for what happened at those places. But the Vault program contained 122 of these places, and the names we have for most of them are only numbers. The stories those numbers contain are not in the record. The people inside them, the people who lived and organized and argued and adapted and failed to adapt and eventually died in those sealed rooms, do not have the kind of documentation that the more famous vaults have. They are unnamed characters in stories that were not fully witnessed. This is the final honesty of the Vault program, fictional though it is. The scale of the harm it caused was never fully documented, because documentation requires witnesses, and the witnesses were sealed inside the facilities, and the facilities were sealed inside the earth, and most of what happened inside them happened in a silence that no one with the capacity to record it could hear. The stories we have are the ones that survived. They are enough to form a picture. The full picture is larger and darker, and probably stranger than the portion we can see. The full picture is the 122 vaults in their entirety, most of them known only as numbers, all of them containing people who were more than what the experiments needed them to be, all of them containing, somewhere in the record, in a terminal entry, in an audio log, in the arrangement of objects left behind in a room where something happened, the evidence that people were there. People were there. That is what the vaults tell you. That is what the vaults have always been telling you. Sleep well. You have been in these corridors a long time.